The morning Eliza Harrow rode into Caldwell Flats to file her homestead claim, Dale Pruitt was already at the land office window. He didn't look up when the door opened. He was counting bills slowly, the way a man does when he wants everyone in the room to know he has more money than he needs. The county land agent, a thin, nervous little man named Odell Finch, stood behind the counter watching Pruitt's fingers like a dog watching a bone. "That parcel across the creek," Pruitt said. "The Harrow quarter section. I want it added to my deed before noon." Odell cleared his throat. "Mr. Pruitt, there's a complication." Pruitt set the bills on the counter and finally looked up. He had a broad, weathered face and pale eyes that had a way of making people feel smaller than they actually were. "What complication?" "The widow came in this morning." Odell's voice dropped like he was confessing something. "She filed legal, paid the fee, the claims registered." The silence lasted about 4 seconds. Then Dale Pruitt picked up his money, folded it into his coat pocket, and turned to look at Eliza Harrow where she stood by the window. She was holding her paperwork. She hadn't said a word. She just looked back at him with the kind of stillness that could mean anything. Pruitt smiled. It didn't reach those pale eyes. "Congratulations," he said. "Your little piece of land." He walked out, and Eliza Harrow, who had just used the last of her Missouri inheritance to claim a homestead that backed against the most powerful rancher in the Bitterroot Valley, stood in that land office and understood clearly, and without any comfort that she had just made an enemy before she'd driven a single fence post. If you've been watching this channel for a while, you already know the kind of stories we tell here, stories about ordinary people who find themselves in impossible situations, who make hard choices and live with what comes after. If this is your first time, we're glad you found us. Please take a moment to subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next, because this story, Eliza Harrow's story, is one that's going to stay with you. Hit the like button if you're already feeling it, and drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. We love knowing how far these stories travel now. Let's go back to the beginning. Eliza Harrow was 30 years old when she arrived in Montana Territory with a wagon, a mule named Clarence, $42 she hadn't told anyone about, and the absolute conviction that she was done, letting other people decide what her life should look like. She wasn't fragile, she wasn't naive. She had been married for 6 years to a decent man named Willard Harrow, who died of a chest infection 2 winters back. And the grief had been real heavy in particular, the way grief always is, when you lose someone who is genuinely kind to you. But grief wasn't what drove her west. What drove her west was the 6 months after the funeral, when her relatives descended on her like a weather system. Her brother-in-law Gerald had opinions about where she should live. Her Aunt Rosanna had opinions about what she should do with Willard's money. Her cousin Bethel kept mentioning a widower in Springfield who was looking for a sensible woman who wouldn't make a fuss. They all agreed with the cheerful certainty of people who believe they're helping that Eliza alone was Eliza in trouble. She had listened to 6 months of it. Then she'd packed a wagon and pointed it northwest. The quarter section she'd chosen from the territorial maps was a real piece of work. The advertisement had called it promising agricultural land with seasonal creek access, which turned out to mean 40 acres of stubborn clay soil, a broken-down homestead cabin that had been empty for 3 years, a creek that flooded every spring and went nearly dry by August, and a hill at the north end that the locals called Stovepipe Ridge because it caught every wind that came down from the higher country. She loved it immediately. Not because it was beautiful, though parts of it were. In the severe way the Montana landscape could be beautiful. She loved it because it was hers. Every problem on those 40 acres was her problem to solve. Every decision, when to plant, where to fence, how to shore up the cabin roof before the first snow, was hers to make. Nobody was going to ride out here and tell her what a sensible woman would do. What she hadn't expected was the neighbor. Bram Alderidge's property began just across the creek. She'd seen the fence line on the map, seen the notation that said the adjacent parcel was a working cattle operation, and hadn't thought much about it. Neighbors were neighbors. She'd say hello, keep to herself, get on with things. The first time she saw him was 3 days after she arrived. She was trying to drag a section of collapsed fence rail out of the creek bed. It had washed down from somewhere upstream and wedged itself against the bank, and she was losing the argument. The rail was waterlogged and heavier than it looked, and the footing on the creek bank was treacherous, and she'd already gone down to one knee twice and was covered in mud to the elbow. She heard a horse on the other bank and looked up. The man sitting the horse was somewhere in his late 30s, broad through the shoulders, with a face that had spent considerable time in the weather. He had a cattle dog beside him, a gray-muzzled old thing that was watching the situation in the creek with the tolerant expression of an animal that had seen people make poor decisions before. The man on the horse looked at the rail, looked at Eliza's, looked at the rail again. "You want a hand with that?" "No, thank you," Eliza said, and went back to pulling. He didn't leave. She could feel him still sitting there, watching. It wasn't threatening. There was nothing in his posture that felt aggressive, but it was that particular brand of observation that implied she was doing something wrong. "I'm Bram Alderidge," he said after a moment. "My land starts at the far bank." Eliza Harrow. She got a better grip on the rail. "Pleasure. That rail's been in the creek since spring. It's saturated clear through. You're not going to move it by yourself. I've moved heavier things." Maybe paused. "But your footing's bad on that side. You go down toward the fast water, it's going to get complicated." Eliza looked at him. "Are you planning to sit on your horse and watch that happen? Or are you planning to do something about it?" Something moved across his face. Not quite a smile. "I'm planning to offer again, and if you say no again, I'm going to ride on." She did say no, he did ride on. And she spent another 40 minutes with that fence rail before she got it clear of the creek. And by the time she did, she was soaked to the hip on one side, and her shoulder ached in a way that was going to bother her for a week. But she'd moved the rail. She didn't know whether Bram Alderidge had watched the whole thing from somewhere out of sight, or whether he'd genuinely ridden on. Either way, she didn't see him again for 11 days. The second time was her fault, and she knew it while it was happening. She'd been trying to fix the cabin's east window frame, which had rotted out in 2 corners, and was letting in a draft that made the whole room cold after dark. She needed nails more specifically. She needed a particular size of cut nail that she hadn't brought enough of from Caldwell Flats. And the next supply run wasn't for 6 days. She could wait. She probably should have waited. But the draft was bad, and she'd already started pulling the old frame out. And stopping partway through was going to leave the window worse than when she started. She crossed the creek at the shallow point and knocked on Bram Alderidge's door. He opened it and looked at her with an expression she couldn't entirely read, not unwelcoming, exactly, but cautious. Like a man who wasn't sure what to do with unexpected company. "Window frame," she said. "I need cut nails. The 2.5-inch ones. Do you have any?" He looked at her for a moment. "Come in." The inside of his house was orderly, wasn't quite the right word. It was the kind of clean that came from systematic habit rather than comfort. Everything was in its place because he'd decided where things went and then stuck to it, not because the room was particularly inviting. The cattle dog was asleep near the stove. He got her the nails. A whole tin of them, which was more than she needed. "I'll bring back what I don't use," she said. "Keep them. That's generous, but I'll bring back what I don't use." He looked like he wanted to say something else but decided against it. "All right." She brought back 11 nails 4 days later. He counted them without comment and put them back in the tin. The lantern came next. Her second one had cracked cold night. She'd set it down wrong and the glass gave, and she needed something to work by in the evenings. She crossed the creek again. Then eggs, because her 3 hens had stopped laying during a cold snap and she was out. Then a strip of rawhide she needed for a harness repair. Then, and she would think about this later, with something between embarrassment and laughter, a cup of sugar. She didn't even use sugar in her coffee. She had bought a small bag of it in Caldwell Flats on the vague theory that she might do some baking. She hadn't done any baking, and the bag was sitting untouched in her cabinet. She had walked to Bram Alderidge's door and asked for sugar because she had run out of legitimate reasons to knock and wasn't ready to confront why she was still looking for them. He handed her the sugar without comment. She went home. She put it with the bag she already had. She stood in her kitchen for a full minute, feeling like an absolute fool. It went on through May and into June. She borrowed with genuine purpose when she had genuine purpose, and occasionally with purposes that were less genuine. Each time, Bram was straightforward. He had the thing, or he didn't. He got it or he didn't. He sometimes offered help she declined, and then didn't push it. He never asked questions she didn't want to answer. She started staying longer, not by design, but because somehow the conversations which had started as strictly transactional began running over their edges. He knew things about the valley she needed to know, which sections of Stovepipe Ridge shed water fast in a storm, where the clay soil was too heavy to plant, which month the creek ran high enough to cut off the lower pasture. She knew things too, it turned out. She'd been a farmer's wife for 6 years. She understood crop rotation and soil amendment and how to read the way a plant was growing wrong before it showed obvious damage. Bram ran cattle. He knew less about ground crops than he thought. They talked across the table in his kitchen, while the cattle dog, whose name was Morrow, slept beneath the table and occasionally put his gray head on Eliza's foot, which she suspected was a dog's version of an opinion. She noticed things she didn't mean to notice. The way Bram was careful with his words, not shy, exactly, but deliberate, like a man who'd learned the cost of saying things he couldn't take back. The way he kept the house in order with a kind of methodical attention that suggested he'd had years to get used to doing everything himself. The photograph on the mantelpiece, a woman and a small wrapped bundle, the image worn at the edges, from handling that he never mentioned and she never asked about. She noticed that he watched her when he thought she wasn't looking. Not in a way that made her uncomfortable, in a way that made her feel seen, which was both more and less comfortable than being watched uneasily. By July, the borrowing had become routine enough that when she appeared at his door, Bram would sometimes have the kettle already on, like he'd seen her crossing the creek and figured she might as well have something warm while she was there. She told herself this was simply rural neighborliness. People in isolated country helped each other because they had to, not necessarily because they wanted to. She was aware this was not entirely honest. She was also aware that whenever she spent 2 or 3 days without a good reason to cross the creek, she found herself inventing one. Dale Pruitt was aware of none of this at first. He had his own preoccupations. Pruitt ran the largest cattle operation in the valley, 400 head, 3 hired hands, and a block of land that took the better part of a morning to ride across. He'd been buying up smaller parcels for years, adding to the operation property by property, and he'd had his eye on the abandoned Harrow quarter section for 18 months. He'd planned to file on it himself in the fall. It had a water access point he wanted, and a stretch of hillside that would give him good winter protection for a section of his herd. Then Eliza had walked into Odell Finch's office on a Tuesday morning and ruined it. Pruitt didn't do anything immediately. That wasn't his method. He had a rancher's patience, the understanding that most problems, if you let them sit and applied pressure at the right moments, would resolve themselves without requiring you to do anything obvious. He figured a woman alone, unfamiliar with the country, facing her first Montana winter, would either prove herself incapable or give up from the difficulty of it. Either way, the land would come available again, and this time he'd be at the window when it did. What he hadn't figured on was Bram Alderidge. The first Eliza heard of Pruitt's interest in her land wasn't from Pruitt. It was from a woman named Agnes Coulter, who ran the dry goods counter in Caldwell Flats, and whose observational capabilities were one of the genuine marvels of the territory. "You should know," Agnes said, without preamble, while measuring out flour, "that Dale Pruitt has been talking." Eliza looked up. "Talking about what?" "About that quarter section of yours. He's been saying it's poor land, that someone inexperienced took a bad claim and it'll revert inside a year." Agnes paused. "He's also been saying..." She stopped again, Agnes. "He's been saying that the only reason you're managing is because Bram Alderidge is doing it for you. That you're borrowing so much and so often that the situation is that people are going to start interpreting it." Agnes met her eyes. "I'm telling you because you deserve to know, not because I believe it." Eliza stood at the counter for a moment. She was aware of a particular kind of anger, not hot and sudden, but cold and clear and deep, the kind that doesn't make you shake, it makes you still. How many people has he said this to? Enough. She paid for her flour. She drove home. She crossed the creek that evening because she'd told Bram she'd help him move a section of fence the following morning, and she needed to confirm the time. He was at the fence already, checking the posts. She told him she'd see him at first light. She crossed back. She stood in her own kitchen that night and thought very carefully about what the talk meant and what she was going to do about it. The next morning she helped with the fence. The morning after that, she did not cross the creek. Or the morning after that. She had things to do. Legitimate things. The east pasture needed attention. The root cellar had a drainage problem. She had 3 fence posts of her own to reset before the first freeze. She was busy. She was also, she admitted to herself in the honest part of evening, deliberately creating distance. Because Agnes Coulter's report had hit something real. Eliza had come west to prove she could build a life without a man's help. Not because she hated men, not because she thought herself superior to anyone, but because every person who'd ever looked at her in Missouri had seen a woman who needed managing. Willard had been kind and she'd loved him, but even Willard had sometimes looked at her the way you look at something valuable you're responsible for keeping safe. And now she was 1,000 miles from Missouri, and people were already saying she survived only because Bram Alderidge carried her. That wasn't who she was. That wasn't what she was building. She stopped crossing the creek, and for about a week and a half, she felt righteous and lonely in about equal measure. It was Bram who crossed first. He knocked at her door on a Thursday evening, hat in hand in the literal sense, actually holding it, which was a posture Eliza had never seen on him before, and which made her realize she'd rattled him somehow. "You haven't come by," he said. "I've been busy." He looked at her. "That's probably true. It is true." He turned the hat in his hands. "Did I do something?" "No, because it feels like something happened." She was quiet for a moment. She wasn't going to tell him about Pruitt's talk, not yet. Maybe not at all, because it's her problem to handle, and she didn't want him to offer to handle it for her, which she was fairly certain he would. "I need to be able to do this by myself," she said. "All of it. I need to know that I'm doing it." He absorbed that. "All right. It's not about you." "I know what it's about," he said. "I'm not an idiot." She looked at him. He was looking back with that steady, contained expression of his, and she had the sudden, strong impression that he understood a lot more than she'd said. "Bram, I'm not going to fight with you about it," he said. "You want distance. You can have distance. That's your right." He put his hat back on. "But I'll tell you one thing, because I'd want someone to tell me." "What?" "Whatever Pruitt's been saying around town." He stopped, looked past her for a second. "People who know anything about this valley already know what kind of woman you are. You can't control what Pruitt tells fools. You can control what you do with your 40 acres. She stared at him. "How do you know what Pruitt said?" "Because nothing stays quiet in a valley this size." He met her eyes. "And because I know Dale Pruitt." He left. She stood in her doorway and watched him ride back across the creek and felt the complicated weight of being understood by someone she was trying to create distance from. The following week, she went to see Pruitt herself. She didn't tell Bram. She didn't tell Agnes. She drove her wagon into Caldwell Flats on a Wednesday morning, tied Clarence to the post outside the Pruitt Outfits office. He kept a room above the land agent's, which Eliza thought was probably not a coincidence, and knocked. His hired man opened the door, looked at her, and went to get Pruitt. Pruitt came to the door in his shirt sleeves. He looked at her with those pale eyes that she'd thought about since the land office measuring, amused in a way that had nothing to do with warmth. "Mrs. Harrow." He didn't invite her in. "What can I do for you?" "You can stop telling people Bram Alderidge is running my property," she said. He didn't blink. "I've had conversations about the state of claims in this valley. I can't control how people interpret." "You can stop having those particular conversations," Eliza said. "I know what you want that quarter section for. The creek access and the north hillside. I know you plan to file on it yourself, and I filed first. That's done, and it's legal, and there's no version of events where it goes differently." She paused. "But I'm telling you to your face, that land is mine. I'm working it. And what I borrow from a neighbor to get through my first season is no different from what you've borrowed from every county bank to put together that operation of yours." Something shifted behind Pruitt's eyes. Not respect, nothing that generous, but a recalibration. The recognition that she wasn't what he'd estimated. "Strong words," he said. "They're accurate words." He smiled. That same smile from the land office. "We'll see how your claim looks come March, Mrs. Harrow." She drove home. She was shaking a little by the time she crossed the creek, not from fear, she decided, but from the sustained effort of holding her voice level for that entire conversation. She went into the cabin, sat down, and gave herself 10 minutes to feel the whole of it. Then she went out and fixed the drainage problem in the root cellar. She did not tell Bram about Pruitt for 6 days. When she did tell him, sitting at his kitchen table, with Morrow's gray head on her foot and coffee getting cold in both cups, he was quiet for longer than she expected. "You went alone," he said. "I did. To Pruitt's office." "Yes." "Without telling me." "Bram," she looked at him. "It was my problem." He looked at his coffee cup. "I know." A long pause. "I don't like it." "But I know." He looked up. "What did he say?" She told him. He listened without interrupting, which she'd come to understand was his particular form of respect, the same steady attention he gave to anything that mattered. "He's going to try something else." Bram said when she finished. He doesn't back off clean. It's not how he's built. I know. What are you going to do? She thought about it. Get through winter. Document everything. Make sure Odell Finch has no reason to question the claim. Bram nodded slowly. That's smart. I know it's smart. I wasn't. He stopped. No, I know you know. She almost smiled. You were going to say that's very smart, weren't you? In a tone that implied you were surprised. He looked pained. Probably. Work on that. I am working on it, he said. Believe me, it's an ongoing project. She did smile then, and he looked at her with that expression she'd stopped, pretending she didn't notice, open and careful at the same time, like a man had learned to want things quietly so the wanting wouldn't hurt as much. August came in dry and heavy. The creek dropped lower than she'd expected. Her hay came in thin, not a disaster, but not enough to feel easy about, not with a Montana winter waiting on the other side of September. She worked from first light until she couldn't see, and sometimes she could feel the strain of it in her bones the way her mother used to describe a coming rain, a deep awareness, not quite pain, that told her the cost of what she was doing. She didn't say any of this to Bram. She said it to Clarence, who was an excellent listener and had no opinions about what she should do differently. What she didn't say to anyone, what she turned over in her own head at night when the cabin was quiet and the wind came down off Stovepipe Ridge, was something more complicated than fatigue. She'd been so certain, coming west, that independence was the thing she needed to prove. That surviving alone was the whole point. She'd built that conviction out of 6 months of her in-laws' opinions and a lifetime of being treated like something that needed to be managed. But out here, independence looked different than she'd imagined it. It didn't look like doing everything without help. It looked like knowing what you were capable of, knowing what you weren't, and making those decisions yourself. She was still working out the difference between needing help and choosing to accept it. Bram brought her a load of hay in late August. He didn't ask. He showed up with it in his wagon and started unloading it before she could stop him. And she came out of the cabin saying, "What do you think you're doing?" And he said, "Keeping my neighbor's cattle from starving." And she said, "I didn't ask for this." And he said, "No, you didn't," and kept unloading. She stood it there for a moment. Then she went and picked up a bale herself and started stacking. They worked in silence for an hour. When the wagon was empty, she went in and made coffee. "You can't just do that," she said when they were sitting down. "I know, then why did you?" He turned his cup in his hands. "Because I watched you decide not to ask, and I knew why you decided that. And I thought," he stopped, started again. "I thought there ought to be a third option, between you refusing to accept anything and me waiting to be asked." She looked at him. "I overstepped," he said. "I know I overstepped. But your cattle were going to be short, and I had surplus, and the reason you weren't asking had more to do with Pruitt than with the hay." She was quiet. "Was I wrong?" he said. "No," she said. "You weren't wrong." Neither of them said anything for a while. "I don't want to need you," Eliza finally said. "I don't want anyone to be able to say I only made it because of you. I know that. It's not about you specifically. It's not that I don't." She stopped. "I know what it's not about," he said. "Quiet, I know." She looked at him. He was looking back. "Bram." "You don't have to say it," he said. She shook her head. "I'm not going to say it. I'm not ready to say anything yet." A pause. "But I don't want you to not know that I—" She stopped again. "Eliza." His voice was careful. "I'm not going anywhere." And somehow that plain and without decoration, exactly the kind of thing he would say, landed harder than anything elegant could have. She looked at her coffee. "Neither am I," she said. Outside, the August wind came down off Stovepipe Ridge and moved through the grass, and Morrow lifted his old gray head from the floor and looked at both of them, and then laid it back down with the deep sigh of an animal who has seen this particular situation before and has a reasonable estimate of how it will end. The summer held. The creek ran low, and across the valley, Dale Pruitt watched the Harrow claim stay standing week after week, stubbornly, infuriatingly standing, and began to recalculate. Whatever he was planning, he was going to need the winter. And the winter in the Bitterroot Valley was almost always worse than anyone expected. September came in like a warning nobody wanted to hear. The grass on Stovepipe Ridge went yellow 2 weeks earlier than the old-timers said it should, and the mornings had a bite to them that felt less like autumn and more like the valley clearing its throat before something serious. Eliza noticed it the way she'd learned to notice everything out here, not with alarm, but with a quiet, running inventory. How much hay? How many fence posts still needed resetting? How far the creek had dropped from its summer low? She had enough. Barely, but enough. That was what she told herself on the mornings when the numbers in her head felt tight. What she didn't tell herself, what she actively avoided thinking about, was that the hay Bram had brought in August was sitting in her barn and was a significant part of why the numbers worked at all. She'd thanked him. She'd paid him back not in cash, because he hadn't asked for cash, but in labor. She'd spent 2 days helping him move a section of his north fence that had been giving him trouble all summer, post by post in the late August heat, and she'd done it without being asked and without saying what it was for, and he'd accepted it the same way she'd accepted the hay, without making it into something larger than it was. That was the agreement they'd reached without quite discussing it, something that functioned between them without having a name. She was aware it had a name. She was choosing not to use it yet. The first week of September, Agnes Coulter pulled her aside in the dry goods store and told her something had changed in the valley. "Pruitt's been quiet," Agnes said. She made this sound like news, which Eliza supposed it was. Too quiet. 3 weeks now, and I haven't heard a word from his direction about your claim. Maybe he's given up. Agnes looked at her with the patient expression of a woman who has heard many optimistic things and watched most of them come to nothing. Dale Pruitt doesn't give up. He reassigns. Eliza thought about that on the drive home. Reassigns. It was the right word for it. Pruitt was the kind of man who didn't abandon a goal. He found another route to it, which meant he was somewhere she couldn't see him, working on something she couldn't anticipate. She told Bram that evening. He was replacing a hinge on his barn door when she came across the creek, and he listened with his back half turned, working the hinge pin, letting her talk. "Agnes thinks he's planning something," she said. "Agnes is usually right. What do you think he'd try?" He set the hinge pin and turned around, wiping his hands on his pants. "Pruitt's a patient man when he thinks time is working for him. He's looking at the same thing you are, a thin hay harvest, early cold, your first winter here. He's counting on the season to do what he couldn't do in the land office. So he's just waiting, and probably talking to the right people. He's got friends on the county board.
If your claim shows any weakness, if there's any argument to be made that you've abandoned the property,
Or failed to improve it."
those friends can make life difficult.
Eliza was quiet. "I've improved it. The cabin roof, the east fence line, the root cellar drainage. All documented." "Then document more," he paused. "Do you keep written records, dates, work done, materials used?" "I keep a journal." "Good. Keep it detailed. If this goes to a dispute, you want every day accounted for." She nodded. She was already doing this, had been doing it since July, when she'd first understood Pruitt wasn't just going to walk away. But there was something steadying about Bram saying it plainly, without alarm. "He's also going to keep talking," Bram said. "He can't help it. A man like that uses other people's opinions like a tool. He shapes what people think before the situation develops. So when it does, they already believe a certain story. He's been saying, 'I only survive because of you.' I know. And that's going to get worse." Bram looked at her steadily. Probably. She hated this part. Not the work, not the cold mornings, not the tight numbers, the part where her reputation depended on controlling a story that somebody else was telling. She'd come west to get away from other people's narratives about her life. And here was another one, and it was following her across 1,000 miles of territory. "There's something else," she said. "What?" "People see us together. At the fence. At the store, you've picked up supplies for me twice when I couldn't get to town." She paused. "I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm saying it's what he's using." Bram was quiet for a moment. "What are you asking me, Eliza?" "I'm not asking you anything. I'm telling you what the situation is." "All right, what are you going to do about it?" She'd already decided this, somewhere on the drive home from Caldwell Flats. "I'm going to be more careful about how often we're seen together and what it looks like." He absorbed this. His face was doing the thing it sometimes did, going still and giving nothing away, and she couldn't tell what was underneath it. "And privately," he said finally. "Privately isn't anyone's business." Something eased in his expression. "No," he said, "it isn't." They stood there in the cooling September air, with the barn door Bram had just fixed swinging slowly in the first breath of an evening wind, and neither of them said the thing that was sitting right at the edge of the conversation, taking up a considerable amount of space. "I'll be careful," he said. "I can do that, thank you." "Don't thank me." He picked up his tools. "Go home before it gets dark. The creek's running fast this week." She went home. She stood in her kitchen, and felt the complicated, specific ache of wanting something she hadn't given herself permission to want yet. Then she made supper and wrote in her journal until the lamp burned low. The second week of September brought a visitor Eliza's hadn't expected. A man named Herbert Tilson rode up to her property on a Tuesday afternoon, late 40s, respectable coat, a manner that suggested he'd practiced being pleasant until it became reflex. He introduced himself as a land assessor working on behalf of the county, and said he'd been asked to verify improvements on the newer homestead claims in the valley. Eliza let him look. She walked him through the cabin, showed him the roof repairs and the new window frame and the root cellar work. She showed him the east fence line and the portion of the hay pasture she'd cleared. She answered his questions without embellishment. He wrote things down in a leather notebook. His pencil moved in small, careful strokes. "When was the creek access fence put in?" he asked, at the north boundary. "June. I did it myself." She paused. "I have the purchase records for the wire." "That won't be necessary." She watched him write. "Can I ask who requested this assessment?" He looked up from the notebook. "It's a standard review process for new claims." "I understand. I'm asking who requested it." A small hesitation. Just a half second. "The county board initiates these reviews periodically." "And which board member initiated this particular one?" He looked at her for a moment. His pen had stopped moving. "Mrs. Harrow," he said, carefully, "I conduct the assessment. I don't have information about internal board procedures." "No," she said, "I'm sure you don't." She walked him back to his horse and watched him ride south, in the direction of Caldwell Flats, in the direction of Dale Pruett's office above the land agent. She stood at her fence for a long minute. Then she went inside and wrote everything down. Date time, the man's name and description, every question he'd asked, every answer she'd given. She noted the small hesitation when she'd asked who requested the review. She noted the direction he'd ridden when he left. She was building something. She wasn't sure what to call it yet, but she was building it. She rode to see a woman named Cora Mabry the following Thursday. Cora was 62 years old and had been homesteading in the Bitterroot Valley for 19 years. She had survived 2 husbands, a grass fire, 3 bad winters, and a water rights dispute that had taken 2 years and involved 3 lawyers before it resolved. She was also, by Eliza's estimation, the sharpest reader of county politics in the entire territory. They sat in Cora's kitchen and drank tea that tasted like something had been steeped in it that Eliza couldn't identify, and Eliza told her about Tilson. "Herbert Tilson," Cora said. "He assessed Rufus Gentry's claim 2 years back. Rufus lost a parcel." She paused. But Rufus also hadn't done the improvements he'd claimed to do, so that was a different situation. "My improvements are documented, and they're real." "Then Tilson's report will say so." Cora looked at her. "The report itself isn't the weapon, girl. The report is just a step. What Pruett's doing is making sure every step of this process goes through channels he has influence over. If your claim looks solid, the assessment comes back clean. But now there's an assessment on file now. There's an official question about your claim, even if the answer to the question is in your favor. That question is on record, and Pruett can point to it." Eliza thought about this. He's building a narrative. "Even if none of the individual pieces go against me." "You're fast," Cora said. "Yes. He's making your claim look contested even when it isn't. And contested claims make buyers nervous, make neighbors cautious, make the county board inclined to scrutinize rather than approve when you need something approved. What do I do?" Cora wrapped both hands around her teacup. "You make sure your claim looks so thoroughly established and so obviously productive that there's nothing to point at. You also need people who'll say so publicly. Not just one neighbor." She paused, and the pause was deliberate, not just Bram Alderidge. "Multiple people. Ranchers who've watched your operation and can speak to it. Those ranchers have mostly been listening to Pruett. Some of them, yes." Cora met her eyes. "Others have been watching you more carefully than you know. There are people in this valley who've seen a woman work 40 acres through a summer and thought, They haven't said anything because nobody's asked them. Will you ask them?" Cora looked at her for a long moment. "Cora Mabry doesn't go around recruiting people for causes, generally speaking. I'm not asking for a cause. I'm asking for accuracy." Something moved in the older woman's eyes. "You're going to be all right, Eliza Harrow," she said. "Whether or not you end up all right." Eliza's had to think about that one on the way home. October arrived fast, the way time does in country where the seasons move with practical urgency rather than calendar sentiment. The mornings were cold enough now that she could see her breath before sunrise, and the creek ran high again from early rain that came in sideways off the mountains and lasted 2 days without let-up. She and Bram repaired the south fence line together on the 4th of October, her fence, not his, and worked steadily from morning until the light went bad. And she was aware the whole time of exactly what this looked like, and unable to make herself care as much about it as she had in September. The fence needed doing. He was there. The work got done. Tilson's report came back, she told him, while they were resetting the last post. Clean. Good. Pruitt will find another angle. Yes. She drove the post bar into the ground. Cora Mabry thinks I need public support. More than just one neighbor. Cora's not wrong. He held the post while she tamped. There's a meeting at Halverson's barn in 2 weeks. Feed co-op business. Most of the Valley ranchers come through. I know, you should be there. I was planning to be. She paused. Were you planning to be there? I'm always at the co-op meetings. Then, maybe you should get there late and sit on the other side of the room. He looked at her. You want me to pretend we don't know each other? I want the room to see me as myself, not as your neighbor. He was quiet for a moment. There was something working behind his expression. She'd gotten better at reading him, and what she read now was not offense, but something that cost him something to accept. All right, he said, Bram. I said, all right, Eliza. She put her hand on the post and looked at him directly. It's not that I'm ashamed of knowing you. I need you to understand that. I do understand it. Do you? He held her gaze. There were 12 years of loss and careful solitude behind his eyes, and she knew it, and he knew she knew it. I understand you better than you're comfortable with, he said. That's been true for a while. She turned back to the post. Her chest felt tight in a way she'd stopped trying to explain away. Thank you, she said quietly. For the fence. Thank you for the company. He said it simply. Not waited, not performing, just said it. The way you say a true thing when you're too tired to dress it up. She didn't answer. They finished the fence in the last thin light of the October afternoon and then crossed the creek in separate directions. And she stood in her cabin that night with a lamp burning and tried to write in her journal and kept writing the same word twice without meaning to. The Halverson meeting was on a Tuesday evening, mid-October, and the barn was full. Eliza arrived alone on time in the wagon. She tied Clarence and went in and found a place near the right side wall where she could see the room without being hemmed in. She recognized most of the faces men she'd bought supplies alongside in Caldwell Flats, wives she'd spoken to briefly at the store, a few ranchers she'd waved to on the road. Dale Pruitt was there. Of course he was. He was standing near the front with 2 of his hands, and a man named Gideon Burke, who sat on the county board. They were not looking at Eliza. They were pointedly not looking at Eliza, which was its own kind of attention. Bram came in 15 minutes after she did. He found a place on the left wall, hat on, didn't look her direction. She felt the exact moment he came in without having to see him. The co-op business ran for an hour feed prices, a dispute about a shared water access point on the North Range. The question of road maintenance before winter made the eastern track impassable. Eliza listened and contributed twice, once with a practical observation about the road that earned a few nods, and once with a question about group hay purchasing that turned into a 10-minute conversation and ended with 2 ranchers exchanging names and saying they'd talk after the meeting. She was careful. Not quiet would be invisible but deliberate. She spoke when she had something useful to say and listened when she didn't. She made eye contact with people directly and held it without apology. The formal part of the meeting broke up and people moved around. Eliza stayed where she was and let people come to her, which they did not many, but enough. A rancher named Floyd Tesmer, who ran a medium operation on the east side of the valley, stopped to ask her a question about the root cellar drainage she'd mentioned, because he was having a similar problem. They talked for 8 minutes. His wife, standing beside him, said she'd heard Eliza had fixed her own window frame, and that she had a window at home that needed the same treatment, and could she ask how Eliza had done it? These were small things, but they were real. She was leaving, she'd said her goodbyes, was moving toward the door when Gideon Burke stepped in front of her. Not aggressively, but deliberately. Mrs. Harrow. He was a gray-haired man with the smooth voice of someone who spent a lot of time at tables where decisions were made. I understand you had an assessment done on your claim recently. I did, she said. It came back clean. Of course, he smiled. A standard review. These things happen with new claims. Nothing to worry about. I'm not worried, she said. My claim is in order, naturally. He paused. You know the county wants to see productive homesteads succeed. We're all in favor of that. I'm glad to hear it. It can be a difficult situation, of course. A woman alone, first winter in new country. There's no shame in finding a more suitable arrangement, if the claim became difficult to maintain. She looked at him. He was smiling the comfortable smile of a man who's never had to wonder if the room was on his side. Mr. Burke, she said, my claim is in order. My improvements are documented and substantial. My assessment is on file and it's clean. She paused. If the county has a legal reason to question my claim, I'd like to hear it stated plainly. Otherwise, I'm going to go home and get some sleep, because it's going to be a cold morning. His smile went a little fixed around the edges. Of course. I was only good evening, she said, and walked past him. She did not look back. She did not look for Bram. She went to her wagon, untied Clarence, and drove home in the dark. Her hands were steady on the reins, and she drove the whole way without stopping. She was unhitching Clarence when Bram appeared at her fence line. He hadn't ridden, he'd walked across the creek in the dark, which was not something a sensible man did in October, when the water was running fast. You walked the creek, she said. I saw what Burke did. His voice had a particular flatness that she'd come to understand was him being very controlled about something he was not calm about. Are you all right? I'm fine. What did he say? She told him. He listened. By the end of it, his jaw was set in a way that aged him about 5 years. He was fishing, Bram said. He wanted to know if you'd fold. I know what he was doing. What did you say? She told him that too. He was quiet for a moment. Good, he said. Just that. Good. He works for Pruitt, or not for him, but with him. He's the county connection. I know. Bram leaned on the fence. Pruitt's been building this for months. The assessment, Burke, the talk around town, he's creating a situation where even if you win every individual piece, you're fighting on his ground. So what's the counter? Stop fighting on his ground. She waited. He's trying to make this a story about a woman who can't hold a claim alone, Bram said. You can't win that fight directly, not with Burke and the board and the gossip already established. But you can change what the story is about. How? He turned the hat in his hands, that gesture she'd first noticed back in August. The one that meant he was working through something carefully. What if the story was about something useful you did for the whole valley, not survival contribution? She thought about it. Cora Mabry had said the same thing, differently. The winter's coming hard, Bram said. Everybody in the valley is about to need something. If there's a way to make what you know, what you can do, useful to more people than just yourself, then I'm not the widow who needed rescuing. She heard it as she said it. I'm the person who knew something the valley needed. Yes, they stood at the fence in the cold October dark. The creek moved below them. Morrow had followed Bram across somehow, and was sitting on the near bank looking put upon about it. You and your dog crossed a fast-running creek in the dark to make sure I was all right, Eliza said. The dog didn't consult me. He just went. You followed your dog across a fast-running creek in the dark. He's old. Somebody has to keep an eye on him. She looked at him. He was looking back, and in the thin moonlight, she could see the expression she'd stopped, pretending she didn't recognize careful and open, and trying not to be too much of either. Bram, she said. I know, he said. I know, Eliza. I'm not ready. I'm not asking you to be. She put her hand on the fence rail between them. He put his hand on the fence rail on his side, about 6 inches from hers. They stood like that for a moment. Go back across before the water gets faster, she said. Take your dog. Yeah, he didn't move for a second. You're going to win this thing. I need you to know I think that. I know you think that. Good night. Good night, Bram. She watched him and Morrow pick their way back along the creek bank toward the shallow crossing. She watched until she couldn't see them in the dark anymore. Then she went inside. The cold was serious now, the kind of cold that didn't apologize. And somewhere in the North Country, in the high passes and the upper reaches of the mountains above Stovepipe Ridge, the first serious winter was building itself into something that nobody in the Bitterroot Valley yet understood was coming. But tonight, in her small cabin on her 40 acres, legally filed and cleanly assessed and stubbornly standing, Eliza Harrow made herself a cup of tea and sat down at her table and felt, underneath the weight of everything still to be fought, something that was not yet certainty, but was something close to it. She was not going to lose this. Not to Pruitt. Not to Burke. Not to the gossip or the county board or the cold arithmetic of a first Montana winter. She was going to figure out what she could offer the valley, what she knew, what she could do. that others couldn't, and she was going to do it in a way that left no room for the story Pruitt was trying to tell. And Bram Alderidge, who had walked a fast-running October creek in the dark because he'd seen something happen to her across a crowded barn and needed to know she was all right, was not her rescuer. He was something else entirely, something she hadn't found a word for yet. She was working on it. Outside, the cold settled in over the valley like a hand pressing down, and the sky was absolutely clear, and the stars were the kind of sharp and numerous that only come in high country before a serious winter arrives. The storm was still weeks away, but it was coming. The snow came on a Thursday. Not the first snow. There had been 2 small ones in late October, the kind that land and melt before noon and leave the ground darker and wetter and smelling of iron. Those were warnings. The Thursday snow was different. Eliza woke at 4 in the morning to a sound she hadn't heard before, a deep, pressured silence that was somehow louder than noise, and when she opened the cabin door, the world had been replaced. It was still coming down. Not in flakes, but in a steady, wind-driven mass that moved sideways as much as it moved down. And the temperature had a quality she felt in her back teeth. She stood in the doorway for 30 seconds, which was about as long as she could stand it, and then went back inside and started thinking through her inventory. Hay, adequate. Firewood, good. Feed for Clarence and the cattle, she'd been careful, she had margin. The root seltzer was stocked. The cabin roof was solid. She'd spent a week on it in September, specifically because she'd been warned about this. She was all right. She repeated this to herself while she built up the fire and made coffee, and she believed about 70% of it. By mid-morning, the snow had reached the bottom rail of her north fence, and the wind off Stovepipe Ridge was driving it in drifts against the barn's east wall. She went out 3 times through the morning, checking cattle, checking the barn, making sure the smaller drainage channel she'd dug along the root cellar's north side wasn't backing up. It was cold work. Not dangerous yet uncomfortable was the word. Demanding was the word, but she could feel the storm's intention in it. This wasn't a weather event that would resolve by evening. She did not cross the creek. She could see, through the snow, that Bram's barn light was on, which meant he was doing the same work she was doing on his side of the property line, and knowing that was enough. The first day passed. The second day the wind picked up. By the morning of the third day, Eliza's south pasture fence was buried to the top rail in 2 sections, and 3 of her cattle had pushed through a weak point in the east line and were standing in the gully below Stovepipe Ridge, looking miserable and too cold to move back toward shelter on their own. She got them. It took 2 hours. She drove them out of the gully with more determination than grace, slipping twice in the crusted snow, losing 1 boot in a drift up to her hip, and having to dig it back out with her bare hand while the cattle watched her, with the flat-eyed indifference of animals who will stand in a blizzard and blame no one but themselves for nothing. By the time she had all 3 back in the barn, she was soaked through her second layer, and her left hand had gone from painful to numb in a way she didn't like. She warmed it by the fire. It came back. She made herself eat something. She was sitting at her table, hands wrapped around a bowl of broth, when she heard hooves outside. She knew before she opened the door. Bram was on his horse in her yard, snow-covered to the point where he was more white than anything else, his cattle dog Morrow a dark shape behind him. He looked at her standing in the doorway. She looked at him. "Your east line's down in 2 more sections," he said. "I can see it from the ridge." She'd known about 1. Not 2. How far down? 30 yards of rail gone. Maybe more under the drift. She calculated. 30 yards was enough for the whole east herd to drift toward the ravine if the storm kept pushing them. The ravine behind her east pasture dropped 15 feet at its deepest point and was invisible under this much snow. "I need to move them before it gets worse," she said. "Yes," she looked at him. "I can do it. I know you can." He sat on his horse in the driving snow and didn't add anything to that. Just waited. She thought about Pruitt. She thought about Burke and the county board, and what the gossip in Caldwell Flats would make of Bram Alderidge riding to Eliza Harrow's rescue in a blizzard. She thought about September, about the careful distance she'd tried to maintain, about everything she'd been building in the valley's opinion since the Halverson meeting. Then she thought about 20 cattle drifting into a ravine they couldn't see. "Come in for 5 minutes," she said. "Let me get my second coat." He tied his horse and came inside, and she pulled on her heavier coat and her oilskin over that, and they stood in her small kitchen for a moment, not quite looking at each other. "Morrow's staying here," he said. "He's too old for this. He crossed the creek in October. He's been reminding me about that ever since. Bram glanced down at the dog, who had already installed himself by the fire with the decisive competence of an animal who knows when a situation doesn't require him. He's smarter than both of us. They went back out into it. Moving 20 head of cattle in a full blizzard on uneven ground with buried fence lines and zero visibility beyond 40 feet is not a thing that goes cleanly. Eliza knew this intellectually. She learned it bodily over the next 4 hours. The cattle were spooked and cold and not inclined to cooperate. The east herd had clustered near the downed fence line, and 2 of them had already started moving toward the gully edge, following the depression in the ground that led toward the ravine. Eliza went wide to the left, and Bram went right, and they worked the animals back from the edge, the way you work a problem, slowly, steadily, without sudden movements that would scatter them worse. One steer went down in a drift. Not hurt, just sunk its front legs, punching through the crusted surface into soft snow beneath, and it went sideways and then gave up trying. Eliza was there first. She got its head up, talked to it in the low continuous voice she'd learned from watching Bram handle cattle, and got behind it and pushed while the animal scrambled. It was a 200-pound problem she solved with her back and both arms and what was left of her patience. And when the steer finally lurched upright and trotted off toward the barn, with a resentful swat of its tail, she felt a complicated mix of triumph and exhaustion that she had no time to examine. They got the herd into the barn, she counted. 19. She counted again, still 19. I'm short one, she said. Bram was checking the east side cattle. He looked up and did his own count. The black heifer, with the notched ear, she was in the east pasture this morning. He was already moving toward the door. Wait, she said. I know where she goes. There's a windbreak on the north slope, a stand of old timber. She's been using it all fall when she gets spooked. The north slope above the mining cut? Yes. He stopped. His expression changed in a way she couldn't quite read. Eliza, I know the route. The mining cut runs along below that timber stand. If the snow's loaded on that slope the way I think it is. I know, she said. I know the terrain up there. That's not the same as the terrain being safe right now. She looked at him. She's my cattle. She's one animal. She's my animal. She pulled her coat tighter. I'm going. He looked at her for a moment. There were things moving behind his expression. She could see them and couldn't sort them into words fast enough to be useful. Together, he said. Bram, I'm not asking permission, he said. You go up that slope alone in this visibility, and something moves wrong up there. Nobody knows where you are. I'm going with you. She wanted to argue. She felt the argument forming the whole weight of her independence, the thing she'd been building and protecting since Missouri, the reason she'd gotten on a wagon and driven 1,000 miles north. She felt it, and then she thought about the mining cut, about what Bram's face had looked like when she'd said where the heifer went. And she thought about the slope above it, about what loaded snow on a hillside sounded like when it moved. Fine, she said, we go together. But I'm leading. I know the route better than you do, he nodded. No argument. You lead. That stopped her. For half a second she'd expected to have to fight harder for it. He was already getting his horse. The north slope was worse than the barn had been. The wind was coming direct off the ridge now, which meant it was driving the snow horizontal and making it nearly impossible to see the ground ahead of you more than 20 feet. The horses were reluctant. Eliza's mare, Copper, a dark bay, with strong legs and a sensible temperament that Eliza had spent 3 months earning the trust of, was picking her way forward with the careful distrust of an animal that knows the ground cannot be taken on faith. Eliza kept her moving. She talked to her the same way she'd talked to the steer, low and continuous, not taught to inform but to reassure. She knew this slope. She'd ridden it in good weather a dozen times and memorized its shape the way you memorize something when you know you'll need the information in a situation where you can't see. She found the timber stand by sound before she saw it, the way the wind changed character when it hit the old pines, a lower note in the general howl. She oriented on it and brought Copper through the last section of drifted ground and into the relative shelter of the trees. The black heifer was there, standing with her nose against a pine trunk, ears back, looking like an animal who had fully committed to the decision to wait this out and was not happy about being found. There, Eliza said, I see her. Bram was right behind her. She dismounted to put a line on the heifer. Her boots went through the crust, and she was in snow to the knee, and she moved through it by lifting each foot high and setting it carefully, feeling for solid ground before she transferred her weight. The heifer watched her come with the suspicious expression, cattle reserve for humans who appear in weather. She got the line on. The heifer objected and then submitted with the specific tiredness of an animal that has spent too much energy being cold. She was leading her back toward the horses when Bram said, "Stop." His voice was different. Not loud, but concentrated. The kind of voice a person uses when they need information to travel fast without panic. She stopped. "Don't move toward the cut," he said. "Move left. Hard left, toward the second pine." She heard it then. It was a sound she had no prior experience of, but recognized immediately at some level below, thought a deep, settling groan from the slope above the mining cut, the sound of something very large rearranging its weight. Snow. A lot of it. The kind of load that builds on a mountain slope through 3 days of heavy accumulation and holds, and then finds the 1 degree of angle that tips the balance. She moved left, fast, dragging the heifer, who suddenly didn't need encouragement. Bram was already moving his horse to intersect with her, and she grabbed his stirrup with her free hand, and he hauled, and she got her footing, and they pushed hard left through the timber and behind the second pine as the slope above the mining cut released. It didn't sound like what she'd expected. She'd imagined thunder, violence, something operatic. What it actually sounded like was a deep exhalation, the mountain letting go of something it had been holding, and then a sliding, grinding roar that built as it gathered speed, and then a concussive thump that she felt through her boot soles as the mass hit the bottom of the cut and spread. Then it was quiet except for the wind. She was holding her horse's bridle with one hand and the heifer's lead with the other, and her back was against the second pine, and Bram was 2 feet away, and they were both breathing hard. She looked at where they'd been standing 20 seconds earlier. The trail through the mining cut was gone, not drifted over gone, buried under 6 feet of displaced snow and debris. That was the route home, she said. Yes, the main trail. Yes. He looked at the slide, then he looked at her. Are you hurt? No. She was doing an inventory, hands, legs, nothing screaming at her. Are you? No. He ran his hand along his horse's neck, checking. Copper? She's all right. They stood there. The heifer was making a low distress sound that meant she was cold and wanted somewhere that was not here. There's another way back, Eliza said. The old creek bed on the north side. It runs below the slide zone. I don't know that route. I do. She met his eyes. It's longer, rougher, but it's below the load zone, which means if anything else moves up there, it won't catch us. He looked at her for a long moment. She could see him working through his own knowledge of the terrain and coming up against the fact that she was right. She knew this part of the property better than he did. Lead, he said. She led. The old creek bed was barely a creek bed anymore. It had shifted course years ago and left a depression in the hillside that filled with grass in summer and ice in winter. Eliza had found it in October, following Copper on a loose rein, when the mare had decided she knew a better way back from the north slope than the main trail. Horses, she'd found, had strong opinions about terrain. She followed the same line now. The footing was poor ice under the snow in the depression, and places where the bank crumbled into the creek bed itself, and they moved slowly, leading both horses and the increasingly uncooperative heifer through the narrow passage single file. She fell once. Her right foot broke through a section of ice, and she went down to one knee in the black water beneath, and the cold hit her leg like a physical blow. She was back up in 3 seconds, but the water was in her boot and soaking through her sock, and the temperature of it was not something she could ignore. She didn't stop. She couldn't stop. The creek bed was narrow enough that stopping would block Bram and both horses, and the priority was getting out of the slide zone before the next loaded section of slope above them found its angle. She kept moving. Bram saw her go down. She knew he saw because she heard the sharp sound. He made not a word, just a sound, and then, Eliza. I'm up, she said without turning. Keep moving. Your leg. I'm up, Bram. Keep moving. He kept moving. The creek bed opened out onto the lower pasture 20 minutes later. She could see her barn from there, the light she'd left on, a warm yellow square in all the gray, and she let herself feel the full weight of relief for about 4 seconds before she started thinking about the wet boot. She got the heifer into the barn. She got Copper into the barn. Bram tied his horse on the outside rail and came around to her side. Boot, he said. I know. How long was your foot in the water? 20 minutes. Maybe 25. He looked at her face, then down at her foot, then back at her face. Can you feel it? Yes. This was mostly true. It hurts, which is better than the alternative. Inside, he said, now. I'll finish with the cattle. Bram, Eliza. His voice was level, but there was something underneath it. Your cattle are in the barn. One cold foot isn't going to get better standing in the snow. Go inside." She went inside. She sat on the floor by the fire and pulled her boot off and found her sock soaked through, and her foot a color that she was not pleased with but was, she decided, not frostbitten cold and stinging and unhappy, but responsive when she pressed the toes. She rubbed her foot with both hands until the color came back, and the feeling intensified, past stinging into the specific deep ache of warming tissue. Morrow appeared from his place by the fire and pushed his gray muzzle into her knee and looked at her foot and then up at her face. "I'm fine," she told him. He put his chin on her knee and stayed there. Bram came in 20 minutes later. He stopped inside the door and looked at her on the floor and at her foot and at the color in her face. "Better," he said, not asking. Better, she meant it. "The cattle are all there. All 20. He shut the door. He pulled a chair close to the fire and sat down, and for a minute neither of them said anything. The fire was loud in the quiet. Then Bram said, "That cut was my fault." She looked at him. "What?" "When you said the heifer goes to the North Slope timber, I knew what the cut looked like. I knew how the snow had been loading up there. I should have said something then, before we went up." "You did say something. You said the slope might be loaded. I should have been clearer." He was looking at the fire. "I didn't want you to feel like I was managing you." She stared at him. "Bram, you almost got that backwards." "Did I?" "You held back important information about a dangerous terrain situation because you didn't want to overstep." She paused. "That's not respecting my independence. That's just not telling me what I needed to know." He was quiet. She could see him working that over. "You're right," he said. "I know." He glanced at her. "You don't have to sound that satisfied about it. I've been wrong enough times in the last 4 months that I'm allowed one." Something moved across his face. Not quite a smile, but close. "Fair enough." She leaned back against the wall. Her foot was still complaining, but it was a normal complaint now, the kind of ache that meant it was warming properly. Outside, the storm had not diminished. She could hear it pushing against the cabin walls, looking for weaknesses, but inside was warm and close and smelled of coffee she hadn't made yet. "What you did up there," Bram said, "with the creek bed route. You would have found it, maybe eventually. But you found it in 2 minutes in a blizzard with wet feet." He paused. "I've been in this valley 12 years, Eliza. I didn't know that route." She didn't answer. She was aware of what he was doing, not flattering her, not managing her in that other direction, genuinely telling her something. "The slide zone," she said. "Is there more loaded up there?" "South face of the ridge." "Probably." He thought about it. "It depends on whether the wind shifts. If it comes around from the east, it'll break the load up. If it holds from the north, more slides." "Could be." She thought about the valley. The other ranchers Floyd Tesmer's east side operation, the smaller claim north of Cora Mabry's, 2 or 3 others she'd met at the Halverson meeting. Do the other properties have exposure to that slope? Tesmer's north pasture backs up to the same ridge. He's got 100 head up there. She looked at the fire. She was thinking. "The creek bed route," she said. "It comes out below the slide zone on the east side too. It connects to the dry gulch that runs along the base of the ridge. I don't know that section." "I do. I mapped it in October, the way you said, knowing the territory before I needed it." She turned and looked at him. "If there are more slides, the main trails are going to be cut off. The valley ranchers won't be able to move livestock away from the ridge. But you know an alternate route. I know the beginning of one. You'd know the rest of it better than I do, the lower valley section, below where the creek bed ends." He straightened in the chair. She could see him mapping it in his head, his rancher's knowledge of the terrain, running against her knowledge of the upper north section, the two things fitting together. "If we put those 2 pieces together," he said slowly, "we have a route below the slide zone from the ridge all the way to the lower valley. Any rancher who needs to move stock away from that ridge in the next week could use it." He looked at her. "You'd show it to them. Why wouldn't I? They haven't exactly been—" He stopped. "I know what they've been," she said. "But their cattle didn't gossip about me." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Eliza Harrow," with a tone she'd never heard him use before, quiet, and full of something she chose not to look at too directly. "Don't say something embarrassing," she said. "I wasn't going to. You had the look. I'll work on the look." He stood. "I need to get back across and check my south pasture. The storm's going to get worse before it lets up." "I know." He picked up his hat. At the door he stopped. Turned. "Your foot." "It's fine, really." He looked at it still bare. She hadn't put a dry sock on yet and looked back at her face. Dry sock, dry boot. Don't let it get cold again tonight. I'm aware of basic. I know you're aware, he said. I'm saying it anyway. She opened her mouth and closed it again. Good night, Bram. Good night. He opened the door and the cold came in hard. Morrow looked up from the fire, assessed the situation, and did not move. Bram looked at his dog. Traitor, he said without heat. He went out. She heard his horse for a moment, moving away through the snow, and then the storm took the sound. The snow stopped on Saturday morning. Not gradually, it just stopped, the way the serious ones sometimes do, as if the sky had accomplished its purpose and had nothing further to add. Eliza woke to a world that was absolutely white and absolutely silent, and in the first clear light, genuinely beautiful in the brutal way of things that have no interest in your opinion of them. She went out and spent 4 hours digging out. The drifts along the barn's east wall were taller than she was in 2 places, and getting the barn door fully open required work she felt in her back for 2 days after. Her cattle were alive and cold and loudly opinionated about the state of their circumstances, which she chose to interpret as a sign of health. She rode the property line on copper by mid-morning. The north slope above the mining cut was changed. She could see from below, where the slide had come down, the scar of it dark against the white, and she could also see 2 more sections of slope above it that had the look of loaded snow that hadn't decided what to do yet. She gave them wide berth and went back down the way she'd come. By afternoon, she was at her table with a cup of coffee and a piece of paper, drawing the route from memory. The creekbed section, the dry gulch, the connection points. She labeled what she knew and left blanks where she'd need Bram's input. It was rough. She was not a trained surveyor, but it was accurate in the ways that mattered. She was finishing the second section when she heard hooves. Not one horse. Several. She went to the window. Floyd Tesmer was in her yard. He had 2 of his ranch hands with him, and behind them, on a gray horse, was Cora Mabry, who appeared to have ridden 3 miles in the aftermath of a blizzard, because nobody in the Bitterroot Valley was going to tell Cora Mabry what weather was appropriate for travel. Eliza went to the door, Mrs. Harrow. Floyd had his hat in his hand, which she noted. We heard you got out in the storm. Heard your north trail got buried in a slide. It did. Also heard paused, looked at his hands. Heard you might know a route below the slide zone, along the ridge base. She looked at him, then at Cora, who was sitting her horse with the expression of someone watching a long project arrive at its first useful moment. Come in, Eliza said. I've got something to show you. She spread the paper on the table. Tesmer and his men leaned over it. Cora stood at the far end and looked without touching, the way a woman looks at something she's already understood. My north pasture, Tesmer said, pointing at the upper section. 112 head. If another slide comes down on the main trail, they'd be cut off. Eliza traced the creekbed route with her finger. But if you move them here, and here this brings them below the load zone on the west side. From there, this dry gulch, she tapped the blank section. I'll need Bram Alderidge's knowledge for this part. He knows the lower valley better than I do. She said Bram's name without hesitation. Tesmer looked up at her. You 2 worked this out together, he said. We worked out our part separately, and they happened to connect, she said, which is more useful than either part alone. Tesmer looked at her for a moment. He was a practical man, a rancher's practicality, the kind that doesn't have much room for anything that doesn't solve a real problem. And he had 112 head of cattle backed up against a loaded slope. Can we ride it today, he said. Part of it. The rest we ride with Alderidge tomorrow. All right, he straightened. I'm sorry, he said, about the talk earlier in the season, about the way things got characterized. She looked at him. Thank you for saying so. It was wrong. Yes, she said. It was, he nodded. That was the whole of it, no elaborate apology, no long explanation. Just a man acknowledging a wrong thing and accepting that she was aware it had been wrong. She respected that more than she'd have respected a longer speech. Cora caught her eye from the other end of the table and gave her a slow, deliberate nod that said, This is the thing I told you was possible. They sent a rider to Bram's property. He came across riding, this time, not walking, and stood at her table, looking at the map she'd drawn, and she watched his face as he put the pieces together, his knowledge of the lower valley connecting to her knowledge of the upper section. Here, he said, touching the blank section. The dry gulch hits a natural levee at this point. You can't take it straight through. You go around the south side of the levee, and it opens back out. She marked it. How wide? Wide enough for cattle in a line. Not side by side. Time to move 100 head through. he thought. 2 hours if they move well. Tesmer said, mine don't move well. 3 hours, Bram said, without missing a beat. Tesmer almost smiled. They worked over the map for 40 minutes. Eliza's route, Bram's additions, Tesmer's knowledge of his own herd's movement patterns, and Cora's occasional observation from the end of the table that proved she had been paying attention to this valley for 19 years and forgot nothing. By the time they were done, they had a route. Not pretty, not short, but real and below the slide zone and usable. Pruitt's name was not mentioned once, but Eliza was aware, sitting at her own table, on her own land, with her map in the middle, and 4 people gathered around it, that the story had shifted. Not because she'd won an argument or because anyone had declared anything, but because the problem in front of them was real, and her knowledge solved part of it, and there was simply no space in that reality for the narrative Pruitt had been building. You cannot simultaneously tell the valley that a woman contributes nothing and watch her show you how to save your cattle. The logic had nowhere to live. Later, after Tesmer and his men left and Cora rode south, and Bram was the last one standing in her yard with his horse, Eliza came out on the porch, and they stood there in the last cold light. You didn't have to add the levee section, she said. You could have let me figure it out. You would have figured it out. I know, but you didn't have to wait. He looked at her. We're not playing that game anymore, are we? The one where we pretend we work better separately than together. She thought about the slide, the creek bed, the map on her table. No, she said. I don't think we are. He looked at the sky, which was the particular dark blue of a winter evening, just before it goes fully black, and then he looked back at her. That look. The one she'd stopped pretending she didn't recognize. Eliza. His voice was careful. I'm not going to keep not saying things because the timing isn't right. I've been waiting for the right time since August, and I've decided there isn't one. She stayed still. I know you came here to prove something, he said, and you've proved it. Not to me, I never needed it proved, but to yourself and to this valley, and that matters. He paused. What I'm telling you is I'm not here because I want to rescue you. I'm here because the thought of going back to my side of that creek and sitting in that house, without this being said, is something I can't do anymore. She looked at him. I love you, he said, plain, without decoration. The wind moved across the yard. I know, she said. That's not an answer. I know that too, she held his gaze. I'm not ready to say it back yet, but I need you to know that not ready isn't no. He absorbed this. His jaw moved. All right. Can you wait? I've been waiting since June, he said. I can wait. She nodded. He put his hat on. He swung up on his horse and turned toward the creek, and then stopped and looked back. You led up that slope today, he said, and I followed. And we both got down alive. I want you to remember that when you're deciding things. He rode for the creek. She stood on the porch and watched him go, and the dark closed over the valley, and the snow on Stovepipe Ridge held its position, for now loaded and waiting. Not done with them yet. And Eliza Harrow stood in the cold with her arms crossed, and her foot still sore, and her cattle all counted, and her map on the table, and the word love sitting somewhere in her chest in a place she hadn't examined in a long time. She would examine it. Just not yet, not tonight. Tonight she had livestock to check and firewood to bring in, and a journal entry to write, and those were real things. And she did them the same way she did everything one at a time, in order, to the best of her ability, making no more mistakes than necessary. But she did them with something different in her chest than she'd had that morning. She was not ready to name it. She was, however, starting to think she might be ready to stop running from it. The morning after Floyd Tesmer rode out, Eliza woke before dawn and lay in the dark, listening to the silence that had replaced the storm. It was the kind of silence that had weight to it, not peaceful exactly, but full. The valley settling into what the blizzard had left behind. She could feel in her bones that the worst of the weather had passed, the way you can feel a held breath finally released. But she also knew that what the storm had deposited wasn't going anywhere. The snow on Stovepipe Ridge was still up there. The loaded sections she'd seen from below were still sitting at their angles, waiting on temperature and wind to decide what happened next. She got up and made coffee, and stood at the window with both hands around the cup and thought about the map on her table. It was still there. She'd left it out the night before, and in the gray pre-dawn light, it looked different than it had, with people gathered around it, smaller, rougher. Just a woman's handwriting on a piece of paper, with some sections labeled and some left blank, and Bram's additions in his particular handwriting along the lower edge. Not a formal document, not anything official. But it was real, and it worked, and Tesmer had taken a copy of it home in his coat pocket. She thought about what Bram had said on the porch. Plain and without decoration, the way he said everything that mattered. She turned it over in her mind, the same way she'd turned over the map, checking it from different angles, looking for the thing she'd missed. She didn't find anything wrong with it. That was the problem, and also not the problem. She drank her coffee and went out to feed the cattle. The second slide came down on Sunday. Eliza heard it from her barn, that same deep exhalation she'd learned in the mining cut, this time from further east, followed by the grinding roar that had become, in the space of 3 days, the most alarming sound she knew. She came out of the barn door and looked up at the ridge, and saw the plume of displaced snow rising above the tree line on the east section of Stovepipe, exactly where she'd estimated the next load would go. She was already thinking about Tesmer's north pasture. She saddled Copper in under 6 minutes, which was not a record she'd been trying to set, but which she noted with some corner of her mind that was always keeping inventory. She crossed the creek at the shallow point, Bram's property, on the other side quiet, no movement at his barn yet, and rode east along the base of the ridge toward Tesmer's property line. She met Tesmer's ranch hand, coming the other direction at a hard trot. His name was Pete Daltrey, a young man, 20-something, with the look of someone who'd just come from a situation that had moved faster than he'd expected. Slide came down on the east trail, he said, pulling up. Took out 30 yards of the main access. Mr. Tesmer's trying to move the north herd, but they're pushing back toward the ridge, not away. How many head? 60, maybe 70. The rest are already in the lower pasture. The creek bed route, did you get the map? Yes, ma'am, mister. Tesmer's got it, but he's not sure of the entry point from his property line. She turned Copper. Come on, she hadn't planned this. She hadn't been asked. She was doing it because the route was in her head, and Tesmer's cattle were pushing toward a loaded slope, and the practical arithmetic of the situation was clear. And the part of her that had spent the fall worrying about what it looked like when she helped other people or let other people help her had gone very quiet in the face of 70 cattle moving the wrong direction. They reached Tesmer's north pasture in 20 minutes. She could see the herd from the gate, a dark mass of moving animals against the white ground, doing exactly what cattle do when they're frightened and confused, which is move as a body in whatever direction the pressure isn't coming from. And the pressure was coming from Tesmer and his 2 remaining hands trying to turn them, so they were moving northeast toward the ridge. Stop pushing them, she called out, loud enough to carry. Tesmer looked up. He had the expression of a man who knew something was going wrong, but couldn't identify the fix fast enough. Stop pushing, she said again, riding to his position. They'll push back twice as hard. You need to pull them, not drive them. Pull them how? 1 animal at a time from the front. Get your calmest cow on a lead and walk her toward the entry point. The rest will follow rather than be separated. She was already reading the herd, looking for the animal there, a roan cow toward the middle of the mass, standing still while the others moved, watching Eliza with level eyes. That one, the roan. Tesmer looked. Old Belle, she's the lead cow. Get a line on her. He got the line on Belle. The roan submitted with the weary competence of an animal that has done this before and knows how it ends. Tesmer started walking her north-northwest, toward the creek bed entry, and the herd, with some confusion and protest and a good deal of unnecessary noise, began to flow after her. Eliza positioned herself at the right flank, keeping the animals moving in the right direction, without pressing them. It was the same principle as the map. You didn't fight the terrain. You used what was already there. The herd had a shape and a logic, and you worked with it. Daltrey took the left flank. Tesmer's other hand covered the rear. They moved 64 cattle through the creek bed route in 2 hours and 40 minutes, which Eliza privately noted was better than Bram's estimate, though she decided not to mention this. They came out in Tesmer's lower pasture as the morning light went full and clear, the kind of winter clarity that comes after a storm when the air has been scrubbed clean of everything soft. The cattle spread out in the pasture and immediately began looking for anything resembling grass under the snow with the determined optimism of animals who have survived worse and expect to survive this. Tesmer stood next to Eliza and looked at them. That's the second time this week I'd have lost a portion of that herd without your route, he said. The route works. That's what matters. I'm saying thank you. She looked at him. I know you are. You're welcome. He turned his hat in his hands. There are 3 other properties along that ridge. Keller, Marsh, and the Boudin widow. They've all got stock in upper pastures. If another section comes down, I know. She'd been thinking about this since the second slide. We need to get those herds moved today, while the access is still clear. Not tomorrow, today. That's 4 ranches, yes. He looked at the ridge. I can send Daltrey to Keller and Marsh. But the Boudin property? He hesitated. Old man Boudin died in August. His wife's been running it alone. She's not had an easy fall. Where's the property? North side of the ridge, other side of the cut from your place. It's the most exposed parcel up there. She thought about it. The other side of the cut was the section she knew least well. But the creek bed ran that direction. She'd seen it on her October rides. I'll go, she said. Tesmer started to say something. Stopped. Looked at her. I'll send Daltrey with you, he said. I know the route. I know you do. I'm sending him anyway. He met her eyes. Not because you need help. Because a second horse is useful when you're moving stock across that terrain. She looked at him. He said it like a man who'd had to learn to say things a certain way and was still working on the delivery. Fine, she said. Tell him to be at my fence line in an hour. She went back to her property first and found Bram at her fence. He'd heard about the second slide from his own ridge view and had ridden out to check and come back and come to her place because she understood. Now, without having to work it through, that was simply where he came when something happened. She told him about Tesmer's herd and the Boudin property. He listened. Harriet Boudin, he said. She's 60 years old and she's been managing 40 head alone since August. She's stubborn, doesn't cover it. Is she all right? Depends what you mean. She's alive. She's been to town twice since the funeral, and both times she looked like someone running on spite and nothing else. Eliza felt something in her chest that was part recognition and part sympathy, and part the specific understanding of a woman who knew what running on spite felt like. I'm going to ride out there, she said. Daltrey's coming. If she'll let us move her stock, she might not. I know, she's not going to want the help. I know that, too. She looked at him. I'll think of something. He looked back. You usually do. She rode out with Daltrey an hour later, up the west side of the ridge, and around the slide zone, and down onto the north face. The Boudin property was smaller than she'd expected, a cabin that had needed paint for years, a barn that was holding together by habit, a pasture that backed right up against the ridge face where the snow was piled deepest. Harriet Boudin was in the pasture when they arrived. 60 years old, as Bram had said, with a face like weathered good sense and eyes that had the same quality as Cora Mabry's, the eyes of a woman who had stopped being surprised by difficulty and was now primarily interested in what came next. She watched Eliza and Daltrey ride up with an expression that was not unfriendly, but was also not going to make anything easy. Mrs. Boudin, Eliza said. I'm Eliza Harrow, the homestead across the cut. I know who you are. She looked at Daltrey, and I know Pete Daltrey. What do you need? We've had 2 slides off the ridge today, Eliza said. There's a 3rd load on your section that I'm not comfortable with. I'd like to show you a route that moves your stock below the slide zone. My stock's fine where they are, right now, yes. But if that north section releases, I've been watching that ridge for 30 years, Harriet said. I'll know when it's going to go. Eliza looked at the ridge section. She looked at Harriet. What did you have for breakfast this morning? She said. Harriet stared at her. What? I'm asking, because you look like a woman who's been up since 4 and working hard and maybe didn't stop to eat. I've been that woman, I'm asking. A silence. Harriet's jaw moved. Coffee, she said. And some bread. Then you'll ride better after you eat something real, which is going to take 10 minutes. Eliza dismounted. And while you're eating, you can tell me why my route's wrong and what you'd do instead. And if you can tell me something I haven't thought of, I'll leave you alone. Harriet looked at her for a long moment. You're a damn difficult woman, she said. I've been told. Harriet Boudin walked back toward her cabin. Eliza followed, which was either the right call or a mistake, and she didn't know which until the cabin door stayed open behind Harriet, which she chose to interpret as an invitation. Inside, the cabin had the specific order of a person living alone, who was keeping everything held together by the force of maintaining structure. The breakfast dishes were washed and stacked. The firewood was brought in and stacked in the box by size. The photographs on the mantelpiece, Harriet and a man who must have been her husband, younger, somewhere that wasn't Montana, had been recently dusted. Eliza sat at the table without being asked. Daltrey had the sense to stay with the horses. Harriet made eggs. She made them for two without being asked, which told Eliza everything about the state of the woman's loneliness that Harriet herself would not have said. They ate. Harriet asked questions about the route-specific, technical questions about footing and grade, and the point where the creek bed changed character. She'd been on parts of this terrain herself, and she corrected Eliza twice, and both times the corrections were accurate, and Eliza accepted them without argument. By the end of the eggs, Harriet said, "I'll move the stock." "All right, I'll move them myself." "I don't need." "You need at least one other person to hold the west flank," Eliza said. "The terrain's uneven there. One person can't hold both ends of the line." Harriet looked at her plate. "It's not help," Eliza said. "It's arithmetic. You know the difference." "Do I?" "You've been doing arithmetic alone for 30 years. You know the difference between what you can do alone and what actually requires two people." Harriet was quiet for a moment. "You're Alderidge. He know this route. Parts of it. Good man, Bram Alderidge. Foolish but good." She stood and picked up the plates. "He brought me wood in September. Didn't say anything about it, just left it stacked by the door. Knew if he knocked I'd send it back." Eliza thought about this. About the pile of firewood silently left at a grieving woman's door by a man who understood that sometimes the most respectful help is the kind that doesn't ask for gratitude. "Yes," she said, "that's him." Harriet looked at her. "You going to do something about that?" Eliza looked at her plate. "That's what I thought," Harriet said. "Come on, let's move some cattle before that ridge decides to do it for us." They moved Harriet's 40 head in an hour and 50 minutes. Harriet ran her stock the way Eliza was learning to expect from women of her generation in this country, without sentiment and without wasted motion, with an understanding of the animals that came from decades of the specific attention that's only possible when the animals are yours and their welfare is your welfare. They didn't talk much during the work. They didn't need to. Eliza took the position she'd been told to take and held it, and Harriet directed the operation from the front with the spare efficiency of someone who had been doing this since before Eliza was born. When the cattle were settled in the lower pasture, Harriet stood next to Eliza, and they both looked at the ridge section they'd moved them away from. While they stood there, it released. Not a large slide smaller than the morning's, but it came down exactly through the upper pasture they'd just cleared, and the sound of it carried clean across the valley in the winter air, and the dust of it rose above the tree line and drifted south. Daltrey said something under his breath. Harriet said nothing. Eliza looked at the empty upper pasture and thought about what it would have looked like if the cattle had still been there. "Thank you for the eggs," she said. Harriet made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "Don't push it." Word moved through the valley the way word always moved in isolated country, faster than you expected, and not entirely accurately, but carrying the essential truth. By Tuesday, every rancher along the North Ridge knew about the route. By Wednesday, Keller's upper herd had been moved through it without incident. By Thursday, Marsh had used it twice, moving stock on Thursday morning and again Thursday afternoon when a third slide took out the last section of the main east trail. Eliza's map, copied out by 3 different hands by this point, was becoming something the valley used. She was aware of this. She didn't make anything of it. She didn't go to the Halverson barn and hold a meeting or send word around announcing what she'd contributed. She went about her work and answered questions when people asked them, which they were asking more frequently. On Thursday afternoon, she rode into Caldwell Flats for supplies, and the experience was noticeably different from September. At the Dragoods counter, Agnes Coulter gave her a look that said several things simultaneously. "I told you so. I'm glad for you. And don't get comfortable because Dale Pruitt hasn't given up." "He's been quiet," Eliza said. "He's been watching," Agnes said. "There's a difference." She wrapped Eliza's flower. "He's been talking to Odell Finch again. Nothing specific that I've heard, but talking." Eliza thought about Odell Finch, who was the county land agent and who had the nervous disposition of a man who tried very hard to serve 2 masters and found it consistently uncomfortable. "I'll go see Odell," she said. Agnes looked at her. "You sure that's wise?" "Probably not." She picked up her package. "But Pruitt's spent this whole fall working through intermediaries. I'd rather know what he's doing directly." She found Odell Finch at his desk, looking at a stack of papers with the expression of a man who has been anticipating a difficult conversation and has just heard the door open. He looked up when she came in, and his face did 3 things in rapid succession: recognition, anxiety, and an attempt at professional composure that didn't quite hold. Mrs. Harrow. He stood, sat back down, stood again. What can I? Is there something? Sit down, Odell. She sat across from him. I'd like to know what Dale Pruitt's been asking you about. He opened his mouth. I'm not asking you to betray a confidence, she said. I'm asking because my claim is legal and clean, and I have a right to know if someone's attempting to challenge it, so I can respond appropriately through proper channels. Odell looked at his papers. He hasn't filed anything, but he's been here. A pause. He came in on Monday. He was asking about the improvement requirements for homestead claims, specifically about what constitutes continuous habitation. I've been continuously on the property. I know that. Odell looked uncomfortable. He was asking about the storm, whether a claimant who left the property during a declared emergency would be considered to have. I didn't leave the property. I know that too, Mrs. Harrow. He lowered his voice slightly. He's looking for a technical angle. Not a strong one, honestly. I don't think it would hold. But he's looking. She sat with this. The specific cold anger she'd developed for Pruitt over the past months settled into her like a stone into still water. Not explosive. Just there. If he files a challenge, she said, what's the process? Odell explained it. She listened carefully, asking specific questions about timelines and documentation requirements and which board members would review a contested claim. She already knew some of it from her conversation with Cora, but hearing it from Odell, with the specifics of her own claim in mind, was different. When he was finished, she asked one more question. Is there anything I can file proactively to strengthen the record? Odell blinked. You can submit a supplemental improvement affidavit. It's not required, but it adds to the record. I'll prepare one. She stood. I'll need the correct form. He got her the form. She folded it into her coat and left, and he watched her go, with the expression of a man who was not sure which of the people he served was going to be more difficult to deal with, and was beginning to have an opinion about which one he respected more. She showed the form to Bram that evening. He read it at the table. She watched him read it, which she'd noticed. She liked doing the way his attention moved over a thing that mattered, steady and complete. What do you need to document, he said. She had a list. The roof repairs, the fence work, the root cellar drainage, the pasture clearing, the new window frame, the creek access fence, dates and materials and her own labor. Witnesses, she said. It's stronger with witnesses. People who've seen the improvements themselves. Tesmer, yes. Cora Mabry, I'll ask her. Harriet Boudin, he looked at her. She's been here? No, but she's seen the creek bed work from her side of the ridge. It's connected to my property. He nodded slowly. I can witness the fence work and the root cellar. I've seen both. She looked at him. Pruitt's going to say you're not a neutral party. Pruitt can say what he likes. I have no legal interest in your claim, and I observe the work directly. That's what a witness affidavit requires. He'll use it. He's going to use whatever he can use, Bram said. That's been true from the beginning. You can't run your operation around what Dale Pruitt is going to say about it. She knew he was right. She'd known it since September, but she'd been operating as if she could control the story by controlling the appearances, and the storm had stripped that down to the simpler truth. You do the work, you document the work, you let the record speak. All right, she said. Will you write the witness statement? Yes. Thank you. He looked at her. You're going to win this, Eliza. I want you to understand that. I think that. You said that before. I'm saying it again. Because you look like you're not entirely sure. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind was moving through the upper branches of the pine at the north corner of her cabin, and inside the lamp was burning low, and she could see, in the flame's reflection on the window, the two of them at the table, the map and the form between them. I'm sure, she said. I'm just tired, I know. It's a different thing. I know it's a different thing. She looked at the form. I'll get the statements together this week. I'll have mine written by Friday. She nodded. They sat at the table for a while longer, not because there was more business, but because neither of them moved. The fire was good, and the lamp was warm, and Morrow was making the deep, settled sound of an old dog in a comfortable place. And the moment had the particular quality of things that are ordinary and not ordinary at the same time. Harriet Boudin said you brought her wood in September, Eliza said, without knocking. Bram looked at the table. She told you that. She did. She wasn't supposed to know who brought it. Harriet Boudin notices everything. A pause. She said it was foolish but good. That's about right. I thought it was. She stopped. Started again. I thought it was the right way to help someone who would refuse it directly. Quietly, without making them feel obligated, he looked up. I'm thinking about whether I do that, she said. Whether I've spent this whole fall refusing help in ways that weren't actually independent. Just proud. He waited. There's a difference, she said slowly, between building something for yourself and building something alone. I think I confused them. He was very still. I didn't need to do all of it by myself, she said. I needed to know I was capable of doing it. That's different. Yes, he said, it is. I've known that for a while. I just didn't want to say it out loud because saying it out loud felt like losing something. Did it? Feel like losing something? Just now? She thought about it honestly. No, she said. It felt like putting something down. He didn't say anything. He looked at her with that open, careful expression, and she looked back, and the fire settled in the grate, and the situation between them had, in the space of one ordinary evening, at a table with a form and a map, rearranged itself into something that she could no longer describe as not ready, without knowing she was being dishonest. She wasn't going to say it tonight. Not because she was afraid of it, but because she wanted to say it right. And tonight wasn't the right, she stopped herself. Bram had told her there was no right time. He'd said it plainly on the porch and she'd dismissed it, but sitting here now she understood what he meant. The right time was the time when you stopped waiting for the right time. She looked at him. Bram, yes. The thing I said I wasn't ready to say. He was completely still. I'm getting closer, she said. Something happened in his face. Not relief, exactly, something quieter than that. The settling of something that had been held tight for a long time. Okay, he said, that's all. That's enough. She stood and picked up the form. He stood too and got his coat, and she walked up to the door, and the winter air came in cold and clear when she opened it. He stopped in the doorway, turned. She was right there, closer than she'd planned. The cabin was small, and for a moment they were simply in the same space, close enough that she could see the particular amber of his eyes in the lamplight. He raised his hand and tucked a strand of hair back from her face. That was all. One simple, careful motion. Good night, Eliza. Good night. He went. She closed the door and stood with her hand on it for a long moment. Then she went to her table and sat down and pulled the form toward her and began writing. And she wrote steadily and clear for 2 hours, setting down everything she had built on this land. In the past 8 months, the work, the dates, the materials, the evidence of a life being constructed one honest day at a time. She submitted the affidavit on the following Monday. Odell Finch received it with the careful expression of a man who had seen enough documents to understand what a thorough one looked like. And this one was thorough. 6 witness statements. Bram's, Tesmer's, Cora Mabry's Cora had written 3 dense paragraphs in handwriting like the tracks of a deliberate bird, and Agnes Coulter's, and Harriet Boudin's, which was 4 sentences and said exactly what it meant and nothing more. She also submitted, separately, a letter to the county board describing the route along the ridge base that had allowed the valley ranchers to move their stock during the storm, not requesting anything, not defending herself, simply informing the board that this route existed, had been used by 4 ranch operations during the emergency, and remained available. She signed it. Eliza Harrow, holder of homestead, claim 7,734, Bitterroot Valley, Montana Territory. Gideon Burke, she was told by Agnes Coulter 3 days later, had read the letter twice and then set it on his desk and not moved it for the rest of the day. Dale Pruitt, when he heard about the affidavit and the letter, said nothing to anyone that was reported back to Eliza, which was, Agnes observed, a different kind of silence from the one he'd had in October. That one had been the silence of a patient man waiting. This one had more of the quality of a man recalculating. He hadn't given up. Eliza knew that. He wasn't the type, and the water access and the north hillside still had value to him, and a man like Pruitt didn't simply redirect because a winter went badly for him. But the story had changed. That was what Cora had told her to do. Back in October, stop fighting on Pruitt's ground and change what the story was about. And somewhere between the blizzard and the sliding ridge and 64 of Tesmer's cattle following an old roan cow through a creek bed, the story had changed. It wasn't the story of a widow who couldn't survive alone. It was the story of a woman who had mapped the ridge in October, in good weather, because she'd been told to know the terrain before she needed it. And when she needed it, she'd known it. And the valley had benefited from her knowing it. You couldn't tell both stories. There wasn't room. On Friday of that week, Cora Mabry rode up to her gate and knocked and came in and drank coffee and looked at the map still on the table, improved now, with corrections from 3 people and a proper notation of the levee section, and said, without preamble, Keller and Marsh have been talking. About what? About a formal agreement for shared trail use along that route, a permanent easement legally established that all the ridge properties could use in emergencies. She paused. They want to know if you'd be involved in drafting it. Eliza set her cup down. Keller said it was your route, Cora said. His words were, the Harrow woman mapped it. We should have her at the table. She sat with this for a moment. Yes, she said, I'll be at the table. Cora nodded. There was something in the old woman's expression, not pride exactly, but adjacent to it. The look of someone who has been watching a thing develop over time and is now seeing it arrive at what she expected. You look satisfied, Eliza said. I've lived in this valley a long time, Cora said. You learned to recognize when something is going to work out. I thought ya said the valley was politically complicated, and Pruitt had friends on the board. It is. He does. Cora picked up her cup. You're going to deal with both of those things. This isn't over. A pause. But it's going differently than he planned. And that's enough for now. Eliza thought about the sugar tin on her shelf. The one she'd borrowed in June, borrowed with a purpose that had nothing to do with sugar and never returned because she'd never quite been able to formulate the reason she was returning it. She looked at it across the kitchen. In the morning, she had cattle to feed and a root cellar to check and a response to write to Keller's proposed meeting. She had an affidavit on file and 5 witness statements supporting it and a route that the valley was using. She had 40 acres that were hers, legally and completely and without question, surviving their first Montana winter with all the cattle she'd started with and a root cellar that was holding. She was not the woman who'd stood in Odell Finch's office in March with the last of her Missouri inheritance and a conviction that she could make something out of difficult ground. She was still that woman. But she was also more than that woman now. She went to bed when the lamp burned low, and she slept without trouble. And in the morning, the sky over Stovepipe Ridge was clear and cold and entirely itself. The meeting at Keller's ranch happened on a Tuesday in late November, 3 weeks after the last slide came off Stovepipe Ridge. By then, the snow had settled and compacted, and the immediate emergency was over. But the memory of it was still fresh enough that 8 ranchers rode to Keller's barn, without needing much persuasion. These were people who had watched their upper herds move through a creekbed route in a blizzard, and understood, with the particular clarity that near loss produces, that the main ridge trails were not adequate protection against a serious winter. Eliza arrived on time, not early, which would have looked like she was trying to establish something, and not late, which would have looked like she wasn't serious. She tied copper at the rail, went in, found a place at the long table Keller had set up in the center of the barn, and put her copy of the route map in front of her. She looked around the room. Tesmer was there, and Keller and Marsh. Cora Mabry had come, which Eliza suspected was not strictly necessary, but which sent its own signal. Cora's presence at a meeting implied the meeting was worth attending. Harriet Boudin had not come, which surprised Eliza until she noticed there was a chair at the end of the table with a piece of paper on it and a note in 4-sentence handwriting that said, "I've marked the north section corrections on the attached. HB." She felt a specific warmth for Harriet Boudin that she suspected was mutual and would never be directly discussed by either of them. Dale Pruitt was not there. She'd half expected him. He had the kind of presence in valley matters that tended to insert itself into significant meetings, and a formal trail easement agreement involving 8 properties was significant. His absence was notable, and the ranchers in the room were aware of it, and nobody mentioned it, which was itself a kind of statement. Gideon Burke was there. He sat at the far end of the table and had his leather notegout and his professional composure on, and when Eliza looked at him, he met her eyes briefly and looked away first. She didn't make anything of it. She had other things to focus on. The meeting ran 2 hours. She had not planned to lead it. Keller opened it, and Tesmer laid out the basic proposition, a formal shared easement along the ridge route, legally registered with the county, available to all signatory properties in declared emergencies. The legal questions were real. Who maintained which sections? What constituted an emergency? What liability attached to each property owner for trail conditions on their land? She answered questions when she had answers. When Keller asked about the entry point on the north section, she showed him on the map. When Marsh asked about the levee section, she deferred to Bram's notes, which she'd incorporated into the revised map with his name attached. When someone asked about the eastern connection point, the section that ran through her own property, she said clearly and without elaboration that she was willing to register that section as a permanent easement in the county record. A silence followed this, not a hostile one. The silence of people absorbing a significant concession. That's your land, Tesmer said. You're giving the valley a right-of-way across it. I'm registering a trail that's already there and that people are already using, she said. The easement just makes it legal and permanent. If another winter comes like this one, I'd rather have it settled in writing than be having this conversation again in an emergency. Keller looked at Marsh. Marsh looked at his copy of the map. I'll match it, Keller said. The section through my lower pasture. I'll register it. Marsh said the same. Tesmer followed. By the end of the meeting, 6 of the 8 properties had agreed to register their sections, with the remaining 2 asking for 2 weeks to consult with their wives, which Eliza privately thought was a reasonable approach to any significant land decision. Burke had been writing throughout. When the meeting broke up and people moved toward the door, he stopped beside Eliza. The county board will need to review the easement filings, he said. I know, it's a straightforward process. For properties with clean records, he paused. Your affidavit is thorough, Mrs. Harrow. One of the more complete filings I've seen in some time. She looked at him. He was not meeting her eyes at quite the level he had in September, which she found interesting. Thank you, she said. Any challenge to claim 7,734 would need substantial grounds. He said this to his notebook rather than to her. Grounds, I'm not certain exist. She understood what he was doing. Not an apology. A man like Burke didn't do apologies. He did adjustments. He was adjusting. Telling her, in the language of a man who spent his life speaking carefully in rooms where things were being decided, that the ground had shifted. I appreciate you saying so, she said, evenly. Without gratitude, that would have embarrassed them both. He nodded and left. Cora appeared at her elbow. Well, she said. Well, Eliza agreed. Pruitt's going to hear about this before sundown. I know. Are you worried? Eliza thought about it honestly. A little. Not the way I was in September. She looked at the map in her hands. In September, I was worried about the story. Now, I'm worried about whether the easement filings go through cleanly and whether the north section footing holds in a hard spring thaw. Cora made the sound that was her version of a laugh. That's the right thing to be worried about. I learned from someone. You learned from yourself, Cora said. I just told you to keep going. The easement filings went to the county board in December. All 8 properties had signed. By then the 2 holdouts had consulted their wives, and both wives had said yes without apparent hesitation, which Tesmer reported with the expression of a man who had expected this outcome. Pruitt appeared at the county board meeting where the filings were reviewed. He came alone, no Burke beside him, which meant either Burke had declined to be associated with this particular move or Pruitt hadn't asked him. He objected on grounds that the easement through claim 7,734 was premature, given what he called the uncertain status of the underlying claim. Eliza was in the room. She had brought her affidavit and her 6 witness statements, and a copy of Casper's account of the November stock movement, and a letter from Keller that described, in the spare factual language of a working rancher, what had happened on his north section when the second slide came down. She did not speak during Pruitt's objection. When he finished, the board chair, a weathered man named Aldous Creech, who had been running these meetings for 11 years and had the patience of someone who has heard everything at least twice, looked at the stack of documents on the table in front of him and then looked at Pruitt. Mr. Pruitt, he said, do you have a filed challenge to claim 7,734? Not at this time, but then the claim is valid and the underlying property is in good standing. Creech looked at the rest of the board. The easement filings appear to be in order. Burke, you've reviewed them. Burke, sitting at the board table, looked at his notebook. They're in order. Pruitt's pale eyes moved around the room. They landed on Eliza for a moment, flat and calculating, the same eyes she'd seen in the land office in March, only now with something different underneath them. Not defeat exactly. The specific recognition of a man who has run a play and watched it fail and is already thinking about the next one. She met his gaze. She'd spent 8 months being afraid of that gaze, afraid of what it represented, what it could do, what story it was building. She was done being afraid of it. He was a man with money and influence and patience, and he might try again, and if he tried again, she would deal with that when it happened. But she was not going to spend another 8 months running a life shaped by the negative space of what Dale Pruitt wanted. The filings were approved. He left without speaking to her. She watched him go and felt the absence of the feeling she'd expected. There was no triumph in it, nothing that felt like winning. Just a door closing on something that had taken too much of her attention for too long. The relief of it was quieter than she'd imagined. She gathered her documents and walked out into the December cold and stood in the main street of Caldwell Flats and looked at the sky, which was the pale, clear blue of a winter afternoon, heading toward early dark. She stood there for a minute, just that stood there with the filings approved and the claim secure and the easement legal, and let it all sit. Then she tied Clarence to the post, went into Agnes Coulter's store, and bought herself a good piece of salt pork and a tin of peaches, because she was going to make a decent supper and she deserved it. She told Bram that evening. He was at her table. This had become unremarkable, him being at her table, the same way it had become unremarkable that Morrow slept by her fire and seemed to prefer it to his own fireplace. And she told him about the board meeting and Pruitt's objection and the filings being approved and the look on Pruitt's face when Burke said everything was in order. Bram listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Is it done?" he said. "The easement is done. The challenge threat," she considered. "I don't think he's done, but I think the ground is different now. He'd need something solid to file a real challenge, and the affidavit makes that harder. Much harder." "Yes." She looked at the table. "Cora thinks he'll wait. See if I make a mistake in year 2 that gives him something to work with. He might. Then I won't make one." She said this plainly, without bravado. It was just a statement of intention. She knew she would make mistakes. Everyone did. But she meant the particular kind of mistake Pruitt was looking for: abandonment, failure to improve, any evidence that she couldn't hold the claim. Those she would not make. Bram turned his cup in his hands. She'd been watching him do this for months and had never asked him about it. It was just a habit, the way some people drummed their fingers or looked at the ceiling when they were thinking. "I want to say something," he said. "All right. I've been patient." He looked up. "Since the porch. Since November. I've been patient because you said you needed time, and I meant it when I said I could wait." She looked at him. "I'm not asking for a decision," he said. "I'm not putting pressure on anything. I just want you to know that the waiting is." He stopped, started again. "I'm not going anywhere, but it's not nothing either. Waiting." She understood what it cost him to say that. He was not a man who said things like this easily, not because he was dishonest, but because saying this kind of thing required trusting that the other person wouldn't use it as a weapon, and he'd spent 12 years making sure nobody was in a position to do that. She got up from her chair. She went to his side of the table, and she stood in front of him, and she said, "I love you." He went completely still. "I've known it for a while," she said. "Since the creek bed, probably. Maybe before that. I kept waiting until I was sure I was saying it because it was true, and not because I was grateful or scared, or any of the other reasons a person says something like that at the wrong time." He stood. Slowly, the way a man stands when he's not sure the ground is solid, the way you move when you've wanted something for long enough that having it feels like a test. "Is it true?" he said. "Yes, Bram. It's true." He put his hands on either side of her face, rough, working hands. Hands that had been careful with her for 8 months, and he looked at her for a moment in the lamplight. Then he kissed her. It was not a perfect kiss. Her nose bumped his cheek first, and she made a small undignified sound, and then they both adjusted, and it was real and warm, and it tasted like coffee, and 12 years of careful solitude finally laid down. And she put her hands against his chest and felt his heartbeat, which was fast and not trying to hide it. When they separated, he was still holding her face. She could feel his hands shaking slightly, which was the most honest thing she'd ever seen from him. "You couldn't have said this in October," he said. "No, or even November, no." She looked at him. "I needed to finish the thing first. I needed to know it was mine before She stopped. "Before you let someone else matter as much as it did." "Yes." He nodded. He understood this in a way that didn't require explanation, because he'd spent 12 years building a life where nothing could hurt him the way loss had hurt him. And he understood what it meant to have something that mattered, and be terrified of what happened if you lost it. "I'm not asking you to give it up," he said. "The land, the independence, any of it. I know you're not. I want to be beside you, not in front of you." She thought about what he'd said in the mining cut, when the slide was coming down and she'd said she knew the route. Lead, he'd said, and she had, and they'd both come out. I know what you are, she said. I've known for a while. They did not rush anything after that. That was the one thing she'd learned with more certainty than anything else over the past year. You don't rush the things that matter. You do the work in front of you. You pay attention to what's real, and you let the important things develop at the pace they need, rather than the pace your impatience demands. The frontier had taught her this with its characteristic bluntness. The winter didn't care how ready you were. The slide didn't wait for a convenient moment, and the good things, the real things, grew slowly or not at all. December passed in the way of Montana Decembers, hard and clear, and demanding in the way that cold is demanding, requiring constant attention to the basic business of keeping things alive. She fed her cattle and kept her fires stocked, and checked her roof after every heavy snow, and wrote in her journal every night by lamplight, keeping the record that had become a habit and a discipline, and something she now understood she would keep regardless of whether anyone else ever needed to read it. Bram came across the creek most evenings. Sometimes she crossed to his side. They worked problems together when there were problems to work, and when there weren't, they sat at whichever table was warmer and talked about the things people who are building a life together talk about: what needed doing, what was working, what the spring might bring. It was not romantic in the way her Missouri relatives would have recognized as romantic. It was more solid than that, more useful. She liked it better than she'd expected to like any of it. Pruitt filed nothing through December or January. In February, Agnes Coulter reported that he'd been seen in conversation with a land speculator from the territorial capital, a man who apparently bought contested claims cheaply and resold them after the original holder gave up. The implication was clear. Pruitt was exploring whether he could simply outlast her, wait for year 2 or 3 to produce the difficulty he'd failed to manufacture. Eliza heard this and wrote it in her journal and went on with her work. She had come to understand something
about the Dale Pruitts of the world that she
hadn't understood in March when she stood in the land office watching him count money. He was not the real obstacle. He had never been the real obstacle. The real obstacle had been her own conviction that she could only be herself capable, independent, worth something in isolation. That accepting help was admitting weakness. That love was a debt that would eventually be called. Pruitt was just a man who'd seen someone vulnerable and tried to use it. What had looked like a threat was really just pressure, and pressure, she'd learned, only works when it finds a crack already there. She'd spent the fall sealing cracks. The spring thaw came in March, early and aggressive. The creek ran high for 2 weeks, genuinely dangerous, the kind of water that moved fast and cold and had opinions about anything that tried to cross it. She and Bram communicated across the swollen water, by voice when they needed to, calling back and forth like neighbors had done in this country, since there were neighbors, which she found both funny and oddly moving. On the day the creek dropped enough to cross safely, Bram appeared on the other bank on foot. No horse, just him and Morrow picking his way along behind. She was at her fence line and watched him come. He crossed at the shallow point and came up the bank and stopped in front of her. He was holding something, a small tin, the kind used for cooking supplies. She looked at it. "Is that your sugar tin?" he said. "The one you borrowed in June." She looked at it and then at him. "You kept it. You said you'd return what you didn't use." "I said that 10 months ago." "I know." She took the tin. It was empty. She looked at him. "I want to ask you something," he said. "And I want to ask it right." "All right. I don't want to take your land. I don't want to run your operation for you, or have anyone say you married me because you needed to." He looked at her steadily. "I want to be your husband. And I want us to work both these properties together, yours and mine, with both our names on both pieces of business. And I want to be the person at your table at night, and I want Morrow to have 2 places to sleep, because he's old and he deserves options." She looked at the dog, who looked back at her with the dignified expression of an animal who fully supports this proposal and has been waiting for it for quite some time. "Is that all?" she said. "That's the important part." She turned the empty tin in her hands. "I don't use sugar," she said. "I know, neither do you." "I know that too." She looked up at him. He was watching her with that expression, open and careful and not trying to hide it anymore. Not the way he'd been hiding things since August, when she'd first noticed the shape of what was between them and been too frightened to look at it directly. She was not frightened now. She'd spent a year proving she could stand on her own ground, and found, somewhat to her surprise, That having proven it made it easier, not harder, to choose to stand beside someone else. Yes, she said. He blinked. Yes? Yes, Bram, that's my answer. He stood there for a second, this contained and careful man, and something in his face broke open in the way of things that have been held together under pressure for a long time. Not dramatic, he didn't whoop or reach for her dramatically. He just exhaled, long and slow, like a man who has been breathing carefully for years and is finally allowed to breathe normally. Then he pulled her in and held her there in the cold March air, with the creek running high below them and Morrow sitting at their feet, and she put her face against his neck and felt the solidity of him. 12 years of hard solitary work made into a person, and thought, yes, this is the right size. They married in May. The ceremony was brief and practical, and held on the property line between their two ranches, which made the legal description interesting for the county clerk, but which satisfied both of them in the way that the only right thing satisfies. Cora Mabry stood up for Eliza. Tesmers stood up for Bram, which surprised no one who'd been paying attention. Harriet Boudin came. She sat in the back and said nothing during the ceremony, and afterward shook Eliza's hand with both of hers and said, "Good," in a tone that covered a great deal of ground in one word. Agnes Coulter brought cake. They did not combine the properties into one deed. Eliza kept legal ownership of claim 7,734. Bram kept his ranch. What they built instead was an operating agreement, practical, specific, fair, that ran both properties as a single operation with shared labor and shared decisions, and both names on both sets of accounts. It was not a conventional arrangement. People in the valley had questions about it, which they mostly asked Agnes Coulter rather than either of the parties involved, which Agnes reported with obvious enjoyment. They removed one section of the fence, between the properties a wide gap, wide enough to move cattle through without trouble, and left the rest standing. It was the right balance. You didn't tear down everything that had defined your separate lives. You made a door. By the following autumn, the emergency trail easement had been formally registered with all 8 properties' signatures and incorporated into the county's emergency response records. When the county assessor's office published its annual report, the Bitterroot Valley Emergency Trail System was described in 2 paragraphs that mentioned its origin during the previous winter's slides and noted it as a model for other valley systems in the territory. Eliza's name was in one of the paragraphs, so was Bram's. They read the report together at the kitchen table, which was now their kitchen table, and neither of them said anything about it for a moment. "Tesmer's going to be insufferable," Bram said. "He told me last week he'd known all along you were the right person to figure out that route. He did not know that in September. No, but he knows it now, and that's the version of events he's committed to." "People do that," she said. "They revise. Most of them." He looked at the report. Pruitt hasn't. She knew. Pruitt had made 2 more approaches to the county board through winter and spring, both narrow, both technical, both finding no traction in the face of a thoroughly documented claim with 6 witness statements and a valley full of ranchers who had used a trail that ran through her land and were not inclined to support a challenge to the woman who'd mapped it. He wasn't done. She didn't think he'd ever be entirely done. Some men weren't, and that was the truth of it, and you managed it rather than solved it. But she had stopped letting his unfinishedness shape her days. "He'll try something in the spring," she said. "Probably through the water access angle. The creek rights. Probably. We should document the creek usage. Going back to when I arrived. I can do that. I've been here 12 years. I can give an account of the creek access history going back as far as he'd need." "Good." She made a note. She was always making notes. It had become the habit of her life, this careful attending to what was real and what was documented, and what needed attention. The journal was on its 3rd volume. The record was solid. Bram looked at her, making her note, and had the expression he got sometimes when he was watching her work, not fond exactly, because fond was too soft a word for what was on his face. It was more like recognition. The specific recognition of a person looking at someone who is exactly who they are. "What?" she said, without looking up. "Nothing. You have the look. I told you I was working on the look. You've been working on it for a year and it hasn't improved. These things take time." She looked up. He was smiling, the full version, not the contained almost smile of the early months, the one she'd had to look for. He'd been smiling the full version more since May, and she'd stopped being surprised by it and started being glad of it, which was a different thing. "Bram, yes, the sugar tin." He glanced at the shelf. The small tin was there, the empty one he'd carried across the creek in March, the one that had traveled from her cabin to his and back again, the one that had started the whole thing in a particular way, sitting on a shelf in her June kitchen while she stood there feeling like a fool for reasons she hadn't wanted to name. She got up and went to the shelf and got the tin and brought it back and put it on the table between them. That was never about sugar, she said. No. I was looking for a reason to knock on your door and I'd run out of legitimate ones. I know, you knew in June. I had a reasonable theory in June, he said. I was pretty certain by July. She looked at the tin. Why didn't you say anything? Because you needed to come to it yourself. He said this simply, without complexity. I could see what you were doing. You were building something. And you needed to know you'd built it before you could believe anything else was real. She sat with this. I was afraid, she said, that if I let it matter you, all of it I'd find out I wasn't actually capable of standing on my own. That the independence was borrowed, somehow. Conditional. And? She looked at the tin and the report on the table, and the kitchen around her kitchen, and also his's, and the fact that it was both didn't diminish either. I found out the opposite, she said. You can't borrow independence. Either you have it or you don't, and having it doesn't mean you have to be alone. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. No, he said, it doesn't. They sat like that for a while. Outside, the fall was coming in not the way last year's fall had come, with its urgency and its thin hay and its building threat off the ridge. This fall had a different feeling. Still serious, the valley was always serious, but not hostile. The work was solid beneath them, and the record was clean, and the fence between the properties had its door. Morrow was asleep by the fire. He was older now, grayer in places that had been merely gray before, and he slept more than he once had, and when he woke he sometimes looked around the room as if briefly unsure where he was, and then he'd see one or both of them and settle back down with the small sigh of an animal that has found its place. Eliza watched him for a moment. There was something she'd learned this past year that she hadn't known she was going to learn when she drove north out of Missouri with a mule named Clarence and a conviction that independence was a wall you built and stood behind. She'd learned that independence isn't a wall. It's a thing you carry with you. It doesn't require isolation to be real. It isn't diminished by love or cooperation or the ordinary necessity of asking someone for help when help is what the situation requires. What she'd built on these 40 acres was real. Not because she'd built it alone, she hadn't, entirely, and pretending otherwise would have been a lie she didn't need to tell. She'd built it by knowing her own mind, doing her own work, making her own decisions, and refusing to let anyone else's story about her become the story she lived by. That was what she'd come west to prove, and she'd proved it. Everything else, the map, the trail system, the easement, Bram, the full smile she'd stopped being surprised by, was what had grown from the proving. In the way things grow when you've prepared the ground properly and then stopped being afraid to let them. People would come to her with questions in the years after, about stock routes and soil and creek access and winter preparation. They'd come because she knew the valley's terrain in the particular way of someone who had mapped it on foot and horseback in good weather and bad, who had learned it not from a surveyor's chart but from the ground itself by paying attention over years. She would answer them. She would also send them, frequently, to Harriet Boudin, and to Cora Mabry, and to Floyd Tesmer, and occasionally to other women in the valley who had been doing this work for years without anyone thinking to ask them. She never stopped keeping the journal. The 4th volume, then the 5th. The record of what was real on those 40 acres. And then, on both properties, operating together, written in her particular handwriting by lamplight at the kitchen table, while Bram read or worked his own accounts across from her. Sometimes, in the evenings, he would look up and say, Eliza, where'd you put the sugar? She always gave him the same look. The one that said, you know perfectly well we don't use sugar, Bram Alderidge. And also come over here. And also, I see you. And also, yes. He always came over. That was the thing about building a life with someone, as opposed to surviving alongside them. The small language you develop, the private signals, the empty tin on the shelf, that means something neither of you has to explain anymore. It accumulates quietly, this shared language, the same way trust accumulates not in dramatic declarations, but in small consistent things, in the ordinary faithfulness of showing up day after day and being what you said you were. She had come to Montana to prove she needed no one. She had stayed because she'd learned the difference between needing someone and choosing them. It is the most important distinction. People spend whole lives confusing the two, believing that love which is freely chosen is somehow weaker than love which necessity demands, or that independence lost its meaning if it didn't require solitude. She had believed this. She'd built the confusion right into the architecture of the life she'd come west to construct. What the valley had given her, the hard winter, the loaded slopes, the careful man on the other side of the creek, was the chance to find out she was wrong. You are not less yourself because you love someone. You are not stronger for being alone. The bravest thing is not surviving without anyone. The bravest thing is building something real, and then, with your eyes open and your ground solid beneath you, choosing who gets to stand beside you on it. The sugar tin stayed on the shelf. The creek ran high every spring and quiet every August. The door in the fence between the two properties stayed open. And Morrow, the gray old cattle dog with his own opinions about every human situation he'd ever observed, slept by the fire through the winter and into the spring, and thumped his tail once every time someone came through the door, without distinguishing between one side of the property line and the other. Because he had never found that distinction particularly meaningful, he had always been smarter than both of them.